Hello everyone, tonight our focus turns to Rome, that monumental empire which not only subjugated half the known world but also managed to dedicate considerable energy to being remarkably petty. Before you settle in, please take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely appreciate the content I share here. Do let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. It's genuinely captivating to see our diverse audience tuning in from across the world. Now, perhaps lower your room lights, consider turning on a fan for that gentle, ambient hum, and let's smoothly embark on tonight's historical exploration together. When the Roman Empire captured a queen, it didn't merely perceive a defeated woman passively contemplating her misfortune in a tent, wondering how her reign had so catastrophically unraveled. Instead, Rome immediately recognized a complex logistical nightmare, intricately bound within the symbol of a royal crown. Queens were never treated as typical captives. They certainly couldn't be efficiently processed, meticulously catalogued, and then conveniently forgotten, much like a mere collection of captured spears. These women represented walking political quandaries, often possessing excellent posture but always appearing at a profoundly inconvenient moment. Rome, above all else, cherished order. Rome revered hierarchy. Rome held an unyielding devotion to rules. And a captured queen, simply by her very existence, defied and shattered several of these fundamental tenets. She had independently ruled her people, she had commanded armies. People had willingly obeyed her authority, an act that immediately rendered her suspect in Roman eyes. Even worse, she had accomplished all of this without any semblance of Roman permission, official paperwork, or even their indirect supervision. Frankly, the sheer audacity of it all was simply unfathomable to them. From Rome's perspective, a queen posed no threat merely because of her potential to fight. Her true danger lay in the fact that people believed in her leadership. While soldiers might obey commands, followers invest belief, and belief is a far more resilient force, much harder to extinguish. Rome consistently aimed to leave no critical matters unresolved. This fundamental principle explains why Rome never treated queens as ordinary captives. A common prisoner could easily be sold, enslaved, or summarily executed without extensive deliberation. A queen, however, necessitated extensive meetings and profound discussions, often culminating in someone inevitably remarking, "We simply cannot kill her outright. Too many eyes are watching." Rome possessed many attributes, but subtlety when operating without an audience was certainly not one of them. Furthermore, the Roman Empire demonstrated a unique talent for transforming individual tragedy into a powerful form of public education. A captured queen, therefore, became an invaluable gift, not, of course, to her, but rather to the empire's sophisticated messaging apparatus. She could be publicly displayed, ceremoniously paraded, made the subject of hushed whispers, and pointed at. Without uttering a single word, Rome could eloquently convey, "This is precisely what transpires when you attempt to rule independently." And Rome deeply appreciated potent visual metaphors. A queen stripped of her power yet kept alive served as a far more impactful deterrent than a mere corpse. A deceased queen could easily be transformed into a martyr, whereas a living, thoroughly humiliated queen evolved into a vivid, walking warning label. Beyond practical considerations, there was also the profound issue of Roman ego. The empire inherently disliked being challenged, and it harbored an especial disdain for any defiance originating from someone who wore a crown and wasn't ultimately accountable to a Roman official brandishing a clipboard. Consequently, the ensuing punishment needed to be meticulously thorough. It absolutely had to be deeply humiliating, and crucially, it had to be unforgettable. Thus, from the precise moment a queen was captured, her destiny ceased to be a matter of justice, mercy, or even simple revenge. Instead, it transformed into a comprehensive performance review, meticulously conducted by an empire with an impressively high rate of public attendance. She ceased to be a sovereign ruler, she became, instead, an object lesson. Rome inherently preferred power to be meticulously arranged and clearly delineated. Power, in their ideal vision, flowed exclusively upward, culminated at Rome, and tolerated no dissenting questions. Anything existing outside this established structure caused profound discomfort among Romans. And nothing unsettled them more profoundly than a rival ruler who seemed to thrive quite capably without the perceived necessity of Roman supervision. Kings, while often annoying, were at least familiar figures. Rome had engaged with various monarchs for centuries. Their behavior was largely predictable. They would argue, negotiate, pay tribute, and ultimately lose wars in a suitably orderly fashion. Queens, however, introduced an entirely new layer of unease. This wasn't because Rome had never encountered powerful women. Indeed, it frequently had. Rather, it was because a queen ruling autonomously violated several fundamental unspoken rules simultaneously. The very existence of a reigning queen suggested that legitimate authority did not inherently require Roman approval, Roman bloodlines, or established Roman institutions. Even more disturbingly, it implied that loyalty could flourish quite independently, beyond Rome's meticulously managed ecosystem. From an unyielding Roman perspective, this wasn't merely rebellion. It was, far more gravely, ideological contamination. The Roman state never officially declared, "We simply dislike female rulers." Rome was, in fact, far too sophisticated and politically astute for such a blunt pronouncement. Instead, influential Roman writers subtly and quietly framed queens as unnatural, prone to excess, overly emotional, or even dangerously charismatic. This insidious narrative aimed to suggest that their rule was merely an anomaly, rather than a legitimate or stable system of governance. Ultimately, this approach had less to do with inherent gender bias and far more to do with absolute control. Rome held a deep aversion to anyone who demonstrated that effective rule was achievable without their direct involvement. And frankly, let's be entirely honest, Rome also profoundly detested any form of competition. A queen who successfully governed her domain, inspired deep loyalty among her people, and actively resisted Rome made the mighty empire appear, if only temporarily, fallible. Rome, however, did not acknowledge fallibility. Rome projected an aura of absolute inevitability. Therefore, when such a defiant queen was eventually captured, Rome perceived not merely an opportunity for punishment, but a crucial chance to decisively correct the prevailing narrative. Her capture allowed Rome to emphatically declare, "You see, this independent arrangement was always inherently unstable." Her subsequent humiliation powerfully reinforced the notion that sovereignty existing outside Rome's direct control was not just ultimately doomed, but also inherently embarrassing. This strategic intent explains why Roman punishments for captured queens were so meticulously designed. They were never impulsive acts of random cruelty. Rather, they were elaborate lectures delivered in public, articulated through the harsh reality of chains. Rome intended for other rulers, regardless of gender, to observe the definitive outcome and internalize the profound lesson without requiring any further explicit explanation. And naturally, Rome, in its imperial pride, never openly admitted to fear, yet that apprehension was undeniably present. It was a pervasive fear that true authority might indeed exist and thrive independently of Roman power. A fear that genuine loyalty could survive even the most thorough conquest. And perhaps most unsettling, a fear that someone, somewhere, witnessing a queen bravely resist Rome, might consider, "Perhaps we, too, could achieve that." Rome did not inflict punishment upon captured queens simply because they had been defeated in battle. Rather, Rome punished them precisely because they had once ruled, and for a fleeting period, had ruled effectively and with distinction. For an enemy queen facing Roman might, capture was never the conclusion of her narrative. It merely marked the commencement of a far more intricate administrative process. The immediate conflict might have ceased, her city might lie in ashes, her army scattered, but for Rome, the true work was only just beginning. Rome never hurried the imposition of consequences. Instead, it preferred to meticulously savor them. The very instant a queen was taken alive, her fate transcended the brutal realities of the battlefield and was transformed into a calculated matter of imperial scheduling. She was no longer considered a combatant, she had become a valuable asset, and Rome, like any truly competent empire, certainly did not waste its assets. Captured queens were transported with meticulous care, not with any sense of gentleness, but rather with just enough caution to ensure their arrival intact at their destination. After all, one cannot effectively stage a public lesson if the central figure of that lesson perishes en route. Roman guards received explicit instructions to keep her alive, conspicuously visible, and unmistakably conveying utter defeat. This approach was far from an act of mercy. It was, in fact, an indispensable part of Rome's strategic preparation. Rome also possessed a profound understanding that time itself could be wielded as a potent weapon. Consequently, weeks, or even many months, might elapse between a queen's capture and her eventual public punishment. Throughout this period of imposed silence, unsettling rumors inevitably began to circulate. Had she survived her ordeal? Was she perhaps summarily executed? Or was she already being paraded through the very streets of Rome? This calculated uncertainty served to amplify fear and psychological torment long before any actual chains ever audibly clinked. Meanwhile, Roman officials meticulously debated and considered the precise role she would ultimately play in their grand scheme. Would she be compelled to march in a triumphal parade? Would she be kept alive indefinitely as political leverage, only to be quietly erased from history at a later, more convenient time? Rome thrived on having a multitude of options. A captured queen provided the empire with invaluable strategic flexibility, and Rome valued such adaptability almost as highly as it valued setting stark public examples. For the queen herself, this protracted waiting period constituted a unique and agonizing form of punishment. She received no information, was given no timeline, and possessed absolutely no control over her destiny. This woman, who had once commanded mighty armies and governed entire peoples, now found her future utterly dependent on the whims of men who casually discussed her ultimate fate amidst the clinking of wine cups and a litany of administrative complaints. It was a profound and brutal demonstration of power stripped bare, reduced to its absolute absence. Through extensive experience, Rome had wisely learned that immediate executions often inadvertently created martyrs. And martyrs, in turn, inspired poignant songs, compelling stories, and ultimately, inconvenient and disruptive rebellions. Consequently, Rome much preferred a colder, more calculated approach. A living queen, intentionally held in agonizing limbo, conveyed a far more potent and chilling message: that resistance against the empire does not conclude quickly, nor does it ever conclude cleanly. This agonizing period of waiting also served Rome's purpose by allowing them to systematically dismantle her very identity. All her former titles were simply ignored. Her royal status was deliberately treated as utterly irrelevant. She was referred to, not with any recognition of her past leadership, but rather impersonally as the woman, the captive, or even the barbarian. Language, Rome well understood, held immense power. The empire was already meticulously rewriting her historical narrative even before the general public was ever granted a glimpse of her. By the time the captured queen eventually reappeared, whether publicly displayed in chains or simply through the pervasive silence surrounding her, she was no longer presented as a formidable leader who had dared to challenge the might of Rome. Instead, she was meticulously presented as undeniable proof that confronting Rome was, unequivocally, a disastrous long-term strategy. Thus, her capture was not the final conclusion. It was merely the meticulously orchestrated setup for what was to follow. To contemporary ears, the term triumph might evoke pleasant images, perhaps something involving enthusiastic applause, celebratory smiles, and even a tasteful, inspiring speech. Rome's version of a triumph, however, was none of those benign things. It was a brutal victory parade, meticulously designed by a people who fundamentally believed that public humiliation served as an essential public service. A Roman triumph represented the empire's elaborate method of transforming military conquest into a grand, awe-inspiring public theatrical performance. Streets throughout the city were ceremoniously cleared, sacred temples were opened to the public, vast crowds gathered in anticipation, and at the very center of this spectacle marched the tangible spoils of war. This included mountains of treasure, formidable weapons, exotic animals, and most crucially, living, defeated enemies. For a captured queen, participating in such a triumph was unequivocally not an honor. It was, instead, the most exquisitely and carefully choreographed public insult conceivable. She was paraded through the heart of Rome, compelled to walk behind the victorious general, sometimes literally in heavy chains, at other times bound by symbolic restraints painstakingly designed to ensure that absolutely everyone noticed she was utterly divested of her former authority. The Roman crowd, well versed in such spectacles, required no explicit instructions. They immediately understood their pivotal role in this public degradation. This segment of the triumph was precisely where spectators were expected to stare openly, whisper disparaging comments, laugh derisively, and internalize the undeniable truth that Rome always triumphs. Rome possessed a profound appreciation for impactful visual storytelling. The captured queen's presence was deliberately intended to create a stark contrast with the victorious general, who rode high in his chariot, resplendent in imperial purple, embodying an almost divine authority for the day. She walked, he rode. She followed, he led. The message conveyed by this vivid tableau was so unmistakably clear that it scarcely required any verbal translation. Her physical appearance was meticulously and deliberately made to seem foreign and exotic. Roman triumphs always emphasized profound difference. This was achieved through strange clothing, unfamiliar and often elaborate jewelry, and unusual hairstyles, all carefully designed to reinforce the pervasive idea that she originated from a lesser world, now neatly folded and assimilated into immutable Roman dominance. Rome, after all, did not simply conquer territories, it systematically conquered and reshaped narratives. The presence of the vast crowd was paramount. Rome certainly could have punished her privately, behind closed doors. However, it consciously chose not to, understanding that an unseen punishment represented a glaringly wasted opportunity. The presence of tens of thousands of people observing this spectacle ensured that the public humiliation would resonate and echo far beyond the city's boundaries. Stories of her fate would rapidly spread, travelers would dutifully repeat them in distant lands, and future potential rebels would inevitably visualize her predicament long before they ever dared to lift a sword. Rome, moreover, relished the inherent delay. The triumph itself often occurred a considerable time after the actual war had concluded. By then, the captured queen had endured a prolonged period of agonizing waiting, acutely aware of her impending fate, yet utterly powerless to prevent it. This agonizing anticipation only served to sharpen the cruelty. Rome, notably, did not need to shout or make overt declarations during these triumphs. It simply had no need. The eloquent silence, the stark chains, and the powerful visual contrast performed all the necessary work. The queen's role, in this carefully crafted drama, was strikingly simple: to exist as living, breathing evidence of undeniable Roman inevitability. By the time the triumphal procession finally concluded, the profound lesson Rome wished to impart had already been decisively delivered. Everything that ensued was merely a matter of meticulous administration. Rome possessed a fundamental understanding of the intricate nature of power. It wasn't sufficient merely to defeat an enemy on the battlefield. One had to meticulously redesign how that enemy was perceived. And nothing, Rome realized, reshapes public perception more swiftly or profoundly than clothing. For a captured queen, therefore, what she was compelled to wear during her public punishment was never accidental. It was, rather, a deliberate act of elaborate costume design, executed by an empire that elevated the public performance of humiliation to a truly fine art. Queens who had once majestically appeared in opulent royal robes, laden with potent symbolism and radiating undeniable authority, were systematically stripped of every single element that had contributed to their appearance as legitimate rulers. Their attire during a triumphal procession was chosen with extreme care. It was exotic enough to conspicuously mark them as foreign, sufficiently elaborate to irresistibly draw public attention, and distinctively unfamiliar enough to overtly invite scorn and mockery. Rome's deliberate objective was for the observing crowd to first perceive stark difference, then perhaps a faint semblance of dignity, and only much, much later, if at all, any glimmer of shared humanity. This elaborate sartorial strategy was not about offering comfort to the captive. It was entirely about creating a profound visual contrast. Roman spectators were implicitly encouraged, indeed expected, to starkly compare the defeated queen's humiliated appearance to that of the victorious general, who towered majestically above her, resplendent in ceremonial purple. One figure, the general, powerfully embodied Roman order and advanced civilization. The other, the queen, personified the very chaos that had been decisively corrected and subdued by Roman might. Rome deeply cherished a compelling visual metaphor that required no verbal explanation. Even the intricate details of jewelry were meticulously considered. Items that had once powerfully signaled royal authority were now starkly reduced to mere curiosities. Precious necklaces were transformed into a general's war trophies, and majestic crowns became nothing more than theatrical props. Occasionally, queens were permitted to wear certain symbols of their former status, not out of any newfound respect, but precisely because witnessing authority utterly emptied of its power proved far more psychologically satisfying than witnessing its complete and total removal. Rome firmly believed that public humiliation achieved its greatest effect when it vividly reminded every observer precisely what had been irrevocably lost. And the discerning crowd, to Rome's satisfaction, noticed every minute detail. Whispers of her downfall traveled swiftly through the assembled masses. Disparaging comments were openly made. Unflattering comparisons inevitably followed. She once ruled them. Someone would undoubtedly remark, scrutinizing her from head to toe. Rome actively relied on this very reaction. In essence, the empire strategically outsourced a significant portion of its punishment to the pervasive force of public opinion. Furthermore, there was an even deeper, more insidious message subtly woven into the very fabric of her costume. By deliberately emphasizing her foreignness, Rome powerfully reinforced the pervasive idea that this particular queen had never genuinely belonged within the legitimate world of power. Her entire rule was expertly framed as nothing more than a strange anomaly, rather than a truly legitimate and sustainable system of governance. Rome, ever calculating, did not overtly declare that she was unfit to rule. Instead, it allowed her carefully selected clothing to eloquently suggest precisely that. For the queen herself, the psychological and emotional effect of this manipulation was absolutely devastating. Clothing, in a profound sense, defines identity. To be forcibly dressed in garments specifically chosen to redefine one's very being in front of thousands of scrutinizing eyes was tantamount to having one's entire past meticulously rewritten in real time. She was no longer perceived as a valiant ruler who had simply lost a war. Instead, she was presented as a grotesque spectacle, a figure who, by Rome's design, never should have held power in the first place. Rome ultimately required no explicit words. The carefully chosen fabric eloquently conveyed its entire message. If Rome desired to render a point absolutely unmistakable, it employed the devastating tactic of adding children to the spectacle, not as an unfortunate accident or mere collateral damage, but as a deliberate and integral feature. When captured queens were paraded in triumphal processions, they were sometimes brutally compelled to appear alongside their own children. This was not enacted solely out of wanton cruelty, although cruelty was undeniably and profoundly present, but rather out of cold, strategic calculation. Rome inherently understood that absolutely nothing communicates total and absolute victory more powerfully than unequivocally demonstrating control over the future. A queen without immediate heirs might still, hypothetically, inspire future rebellion. But a queen whose children stood visibly beside her in chains? That, to Rome, represented an emphatic statement of finality, tied with a grim bow. To the Roman spectators, the message conveyed was devastatingly, unequivocally clear. Not only had Rome utterly defeated the former ruler, but it had also, more crucially, neutralized her entire bloodline. There would be no avengers patiently waiting in the wings for retribution. No rightful heirs would be growing up beyond Rome's pervasive reach, posing a future threat. The dynasty's story, therefore, ended right here, in the public street, witnessed by absolutely everyone. Rome, in its systematic approach, favored clean, definitive endings. Intriguingly, the presence of children also served to soften the queen's public image in a very specific manner, not to elicit sympathy, but rather to underscore the grim inevitability of her situation. A woman seen dragging her children through such profound public humiliation was no longer perceived as a defiant or inspiring leader. Instead, she was strategically framed as a tragic figure whose ill-fated resistance had failed not only herself but, more heartbreakingly, those who were utterly dependent on her. Rome absolutely relished that particular framing. It masterfully transferred any potential blame away from the empire and placed it squarely and unequivocally upon the shoulders of the defeated ruler. And yes, this entire orchestration was undeniably deliberate. Roman audiences were certainly not encouraged to reflect upon the sheer cruelty of the spectacle. Instead, they were intently encouraged to internalize a far more chilling lesson. This is precisely what invariably happens when one dares to resist Rome. For the captured queen, this particular aspect was arguably the sharpest, most agonizing edge of her comprehensive punishment. To have one's authority systematically stripped away was already a profound indignity. However, to be forced to watch her own children transform into mere props in Rome's elaborate theatrical performance was an entirely different, deeper form of torment. Rome, in its pervasive influence, did not simply conquer vast lands. It ruthlessly invaded the most intimate of family bonds and strategically repurposed them as potent, living warnings to others. The children themselves, remarkably, were not always subjected to execution. Instead, some were strategically absorbed into prominent Roman households, effectively Romanized. Others simply vanished into utter obscurity. Still others were deliberately kept alive, serving as a form of insurance or leverage against any potential future rebellions. Rome consistently favored calculated leverage over immediate bloodshed whenever a viable option presented itself. However, their physical survival certainly did not equate to freedom. Growing up thoroughly Romanized, systematically renamed, and completely severed from their cultural origins meticulously ensured that whatever legacy the queen had painstakingly built would emphatically not continue in any recognizable form. Rome did not merely conclude reigns, it fundamentally redesigned entire futures. To the Roman strategists, this was a masterful demonstration of efficiency. To the dispassionate eye of history, it was utterly chilling. This was because the astute Roman Empire grasped a fundamental truth that most conquerors eventually come to understand. To truly and irrevocably defeat a ruler, one must not merely destroy the physical throne. One must systematically erase the entire bloodline that could ever potentially reclaim it. Therefore, when Rome permitted a captured queen to live, it was not acting out of any sense of mercy. It was, rather, meticulously strategic. Rome never confused mere survival with genuine kindness, and neither should we, centuries later. Indeed, keeping a queen alive frequently proved to be the most efficient and effective method of indefinitely prolonging her punishment. A deceased queen could, inadvertently, become a powerful martyr figure capable of inspiring widespread rebellion. A living, humiliated one, however, could be manipulated to actively suppress it. Rome, with its keen political acumen, profoundly understood the power of optics. A captured queen, still breathing, visibly present, and rendered thoroughly powerless, conveyed an infinitely clearer and more impactful message than any execution ever could. Her former people could hardly rally around the idealized image of a martyr if their former ruler was still physically alive, especially if she was continually seen being paraded, held in inescapable imprisonment, or systematically reduced to a mere name spoken only in hushed whispers of pity or forgotten glory. Indeed, hope among the vanquished fades far more swiftly when the very symbol of their resistance remains visibly present, yet undeniably broken. Consequently, Rome deliberately kept certain captured queens alive with calculated intent. These women were then housed in meticulously controlled environments, guarded residences, secluded temples, or austere prisons where every single movement was constantly monitored and every interaction meticulously filtered. They were adequately fed, appropriately clothed, and medically maintained, just enough to ensure they remained physically functional. One should envision them less as honored captives and more as carefully preserved, living warning signs. The inherent cruelty of this existence was remarkably subtle, a quality that paradoxically made it profoundly effective. There were no cheering crowds, no public spectacles, just endless, monotonous days. Devoid of any real power, stripped of her purpose, and bereft of all agency. Rome, with its keen understanding of human nature, recognized that rulers who had once wielded absolute command did not require physical shackles to experience a profound sense of imprisonment. The insidious power of enforced silence proved to be an equally, if not more, effective constraint. From Rome's pragmatic perspective, this strategy represented a highly effective form of governance. A living queen could serve as a valuable pawn in complex diplomatic negotiations, her very existence casually invoked as a subtle deterrent against potential insurrections among her former people. The simple phrase, "She is still alive," often sufficed to quell the ambitions of defiant leaders, especially those who vividly remembered the ultimate fate of her earlier resistance. Should her usefulness wane, Rome, ever supremely pragmatic and endlessly resourceful, was nothing if not adaptable. Furthermore, her continued survival conveniently allowed Rome to systematically reshape her historical narrative. As the relentless march of time progressed, the queen's identity gradually shifted, making her less a sovereign ruler and more a fading rumor. Roman chroniclers diligently worked to redefine her, portraying her as misguided, recklessly impulsive, or ultimately doomed by her own overweening ambition. The extended duration of her life under Roman dominion only made it increasingly simple to persuade the populace that her original rule had, in fact, always been inherently unstable. From the queen's tormented perspective, this prolonged survival felt like a slow and agonizing dismantling of her very essence. Each passing day meticulously stripped away another layer of her identity. Deprived of her royal court, her legitimate authority, and her very voice, she was left with mere existence, utterly devoid of influence. Rome found no need to inflict physical torture. Instead, it allowed the relentless march of time to execute its insidious task. For an empire utterly obsessed with absolute control, the most satisfying punishment was not swift death, but the agonizing spectacle of power gradually eroding, one quiet day at a time. Roman methods of imprisonment were far removed from the crude imagery of iron bars and dramatic dungeon scenes. Such overt displays would have been far too unsophisticated and obvious. For captured queens, their captivity was meticulously designed to be subtler, and consequently, far more devastatingly effective. Rome did not merely confine its captive queens behind locked doors. Instead, it systematically dismantled everything that had ever rendered them dangerous. A queen held in captivity was never treated as a common criminal. Rather, she was regarded as a significant inconvenience that required polite, yet firm, containment. She might reside in a heavily guarded villa, within a temple complex, or in a meticulously monitored private residence, rather than a dank cell. From an external vantage point, her circumstances could almost appear comfortable, and that calculated perception was precisely the objective. Rome shrewdly understood that a facade of visible comfort served to temper any potential public outrage. A queen kept alive, adequately fed, and comfortably housed allowed Rome to readily assert its moral superiority, all while quietly and systematically dismantling the very foundations of her authority. Physical chains became entirely superfluous once no one remained to heed her commands or listen to her voice. The true, inescapable prison was, in fact, profound isolation. Queens were ruthlessly separated from their loyal supporters, trusted advisors, and indeed, anyone who might serve as a reminder of their former exalted status. All communication was rigidly controlled, visitors were meticulously filtered, and any letters exchanged would mysteriously vanish without a trace. Rome seldom forbade contact outright. Instead, it subtly ensured that nothing genuinely meaningful or impactful ever survived the process of communication. And then, there was the crushing weight of routine, endless, profoundly dull, and meticulously structured. There were no decisions for her to make, no orders for her to give, no audiences to address. For an individual raised to command and accustomed to decisive action, this monotonous routine became a potent form of psychological erosion, each passing day stripping away another layer of her dwindling relevance. Rome, moreover, possessed a profound understanding of the debilitating power of uncertainty. Queens were almost never informed of the duration of their detention. Days seamlessly blurred into months, and months inexorably melted into years. Their future existed merely as a vague administrative possibility, discussed in distant chambers by men who harbored no intention of ever including her in those deliberations. Occasionally, a Roman official would pay a visit, not to negotiate, nor to threaten, but simply to observe, a chilling reminder that Rome still acknowledged her existence, and that Rome, and Rome alone, possessed the ultimate authority to decide when that existence would cease. This calculated approach was never mercy. It was, quite simply, shrewd management. Rome consistently preferred its captive queens to remain alive but inert, visible to the public eye but utterly silent, remembered, yet entirely powerless. A living ruler, utterly devoid of any true authority, served as irrefutable proof that Rome's dominance transcended the mere conquests of battlefields, penetrating instead into the very core of identity itself. And for the world beyond Rome's immediate grasp, this message was subtly but powerfully reinforced. Resistance does not always culminate in a dramatic death. Sometimes, it concludes with years of soul-crushing waiting within a seemingly comfortable room, where absolutely nothing one says or does carries any weight or significance. For the Roman Empire, this represented a truly elegant form of punishment. There was no need for blood, no clamor, just a pervasive control applied slowly, relentlessly, and with impeccable, chilling organization. Among Rome's most favored tools was the deliberate manipulation of time itself, not speed, not urgency, but the prolonged agony of time. Rome deeply understood that pervasive uncertainty could erode an individual's spirit far more efficiently and thoroughly than any physical chains. Consequently, when dealing with captured queens, Rome almost never announced its future plans. It simply waited, patiently and relentlessly. Captured queens were almost never informed of what fate awaited them. Execution dates were not scheduled, nor was release ever discussed. There was no calendar to mark, no countdown to anticipate, no discernible sense of progression. There were only days that seamlessly blended into one another, each one quietly identical to the last. Rome firmly believed that clarity was a distinct privilege, and defeated rulers had, by virtue of their defeat, demonstrably failed to earn it. From Rome's strategic perspective, this approach constituted excellent policy. A queen who remained ignorant of her ultimate fate could neither plan effectively, nor nurture proper hope, nor emotionally prepare herself for any specific outcome. Hope, when utterly devoid of direction, invariably devolves into gnawing anxiety, and such anxiety is profoundly exhausting. In essence, Rome ingeniously outsourced a significant portion of its punishment to the tormented intricacies of the human mind itself. Some queens languished for months, others for years. A select few endured their wait for so long that their very names faded from common conversation, their once significant rebellions reduced to mere historical footnotes, and their existence remembered only by the shifting rotations of guards and the diligent administrators filing their reports. Rome, true to its imperial nature, possessed boundless patience. And crucially, Rome savored flexibility. A living queen could prove immensely useful on one day and an utter inconvenience the next. If her former people showed signs of stirring, her continued survival could be casually mentioned as either a subtle reassurance or a chilling threat. Should political winds shift, her execution could be indefinitely postponed, serving Rome's evolving agenda. Rome, in its masterful control, prized options. Certainty, by its very nature, limited those options. This deliberate uncertainty also extended its insidious influence outward. Other rulers, in distant lands, heard whispers and rumors. She is still alive. No, she has been killed. No, she is certainly in Rome. Confusion inevitably spread, and fears soon followed in its wake. Rome felt no need to clarify. Ambiguity, in its calculated vagueness, executed the job perfectly. For the queen, this prolonged period was perhaps the cruelest phase of her ordeal. She had already been stripped of her power. Now, she was losing time itself, her very future slipping away. Days passed devoid of meaning or purpose. Years dissolved without any discernible milestones. The act of waiting consumed her, becoming her sole existence. Rome did not take her life outright. Instead, it mercilessly confiscated her entire future, and steadfastly refused to offer any explanation for its actions. Occasionally, a flicker of hope would rekindle within her, the arrival of a new governor, the ascension of a new emperor, or a potential shift in policy. Perhaps, just perhaps, mercy would finally arrive. Rome, however, permitted these fragile thoughts to endure just long enough to be quietly and utterly crushed by the pervasive silence. Rome did not rush its punishment precisely because it felt no compulsion to do so. The empire had assimilated a profound truth: when one asserts control over the timeline, one asserts ultimate control over the individual. And so, the queen waited and waited and waited, because Rome firmly believed that the most potent form of punishment was the agonizing uncertainty of never knowing when her story would finally end. Popular imagination often gravitates towards executions that are loud, theatrical, and steeped in public spectacle. Rome, by contrast, was an eminently practical empire. When the moment finally arrived to terminate a captured queen's life, overt drama was typically deemed superfluous. The true performance, the impactful lesson, had already been meticulously delivered throughout her captivity. What then remained was merely administrative closure. The vast majority of executions involving captured queens were deliberately conducted in absolute privacy. There were no eager crowds, no grand speeches, no opportunity for emotional closure. Rome had already extensively utilized the queen as a powerful symbol in its triumphal processions, its calculated rumors, and throughout her long years of captivity. There was no longer any need to re-emphasize the message. Such repetition risked inadvertently stirring public sympathy, and Rome, in its cold calculations, harbored a deep aversion to sympathy, almost as profound as its hatred of rebellion itself. Execution, when it finally occurred, was frequently carried out discreetly within the confines of prisons or carefully controlled residences. Strangulation was a common method, valued for its efficiency, its quiet nature, and the fact that it left no public remains that could possibly inspire devotion. Rome consistently preferred methods that failed to generate enduring stories or legends. A death that left no narrative behind was, in Rome's view, a truly successful death, and its timing was always of paramount importance. Executions rarely took place immediately following capture. Instead, they were strategically delayed until Rome had meticulously extracted every conceivable political benefit from the captive. The queen's life was prolonged only for as long as she remained useful to the empire's agenda. Once she became utterly irrelevant, the empire, with its characteristic administrative calm, simply moved on. From Rome's self-justifying point of view, this deliberate approach was perceived as a form of admirable restraint. The empire liked to imagine itself as civilized, rational, and fundamentally above emotional violence. To publicly execute a queen with great fanfare would have unequivocally suggested anger or retribution. Rome, conversely, consistently preferred to project an aura of cold, undeniable inevitability. This is simply how matters conclude, the pervasive silence itself seemed to convey. For the queen, the ultimate end arrived devoid of ceremony. There was no opportunity for a final speech, no chance to reclaim her lost dignity, no moment for dramatic resistance, merely the quiet, chilling realization that the prolonged waiting had finally ceased, and Rome had, in its cold efficiency, determined she was no longer necessary. And for the wider world beyond Rome's immediate influence, the deliberate absence of drama held profound significance. There was no public execution to mark the precise moment of her demise, no clear and definitive ending, merely an encroaching silence, persistent rumors, and the inevitable, gradual onset of forgetting. Rome astutely understood that the insidious power of forgetting was frequently far more effective and enduring than the raw force of fear. For Rome, an execution was never the empire's grand, climactic finale. Instead, it was simply a matter of paperwork completed, a file quietly closed. By the time the queen had vanished from existence, her personal story had already been comprehensively rewritten, her authority meticulously dismantled, and her memory carefully softened into something far more manageable for Roman consumption. The empire harbored no specific need for her to be either alive or dead. Its sole requirement was her utter irrelevance. And once that crucial condition was satisfied, Rome, with its characteristic finality, simply closed the file. Rome meticulously cultivated a clear separation between public spectacle and its true, often grim, consequences. The celebratory applause always came first. The chilling silence arrived much later. By the time a captured queen was finally executed, the throngs of spectators had long dispersed and returned to their homes. The lavish triumphal decorations had been carefully dismantled, and Rome had already, with characteristic efficiency, shifted its focus to its next victory. This precise timing was far from accidental. It was a deliberate and calculated policy. Public punishment served the purpose of education and deterrence, while death, in Rome's view, provided administrative closure. Rome inherently understood that crowds were inherently unpredictable. Public executions carried the distinct risk of stirring unwanted sympathy, igniting public outrage, or fostering inconvenient emotional attachments. A queen killed before an audience risked transforming into something Rome profoundly detested, a martyr. Martyrs, by their very nature, inspire compelling stories, and compelling stories, in turn, ignite resistance. Rome unequivocally preferred endings that generated cold, dispassionate paperwork, not enduring legends. Consequently, the actual execution often transpired only after the city had concluded its celebratory festivities. When the cheering finally ceased, when the victorious general had retreated into private life, and when the public spectacle had gradually faded from collective memory, that was precisely when Rome acted, quietly, efficiently, and crucially, without any witnesses who might potentially care or remember. To the unsuspecting Roman public, the queen simply vanished without a trace. One day, her name might have been a fleeting whisper amidst the grand triumphal procession. The next, she was conspicuously absent from any conversation. Silence quickly replaced any potential outrage, and silence, too, extinguished any lingering curiosity. Rome shrewdly entrusted silence to accomplish what overt violence often failed to do. This strategic delay also enabled Rome to meticulously control the emotional distance between the event and the public. By the time her death finally arrived, the queen had already been systematically reduced to little more than an abstract idea in the public consciousness. She was no longer a living figure, potentially seen walking the streets in chains. Instead, she had become a mere rumor, a historical footnote, a former problem that had long since been efficiently handled. Executing her at that juncture felt less like an act of cruelty, and more like the inevitable closing of a chapter that everyone had already ceased to read. Rome also reaped significant diplomatic benefits from this strategy. Executing a queen immediately upon capture carried the substantial risk of provoking swift and severe backlash from her allies, relatives, or dependent kingdoms. Deliberate waiting, however, allowed simmering tensions to gradually cool. By the time her death finally occurred, any initial objections or protests had lost their urgency. Rome proved remarkably adept at allowing public outrage to naturally dissipate and expire. For the queen herself, this calculated timing added one final, exquisite layer of cruelty. Her execution arrived not at the height of public attention, but rather after prolonged periods of agonizing isolation, endless waiting, and systematic erasure. There was no dramatic flourish to her end, merely the quiet, devastating realization that Rome had, at last, finished using her for its own purposes. Rome held no desire for its enemies to be remembered at the zenith of their power. Instead, it meticulously crafted their memory to recall them at their weakest, or ideally, not at all. And so, the queen died not as a formidable ruler, not as a defiant rebel, nor even as an enduring symbol. She died after the applause had faded, when no one remained to listen, which, from Rome's cold and calculating perspective, was precisely the intended outcome. For Rome, the act of killing a queen was by no means always the ultimate or final step. Indeed, sometimes it proved to be entirely unnecessary, and at other times, strategically inefficient. The most thorough and enduring punishment, in Rome's view, was not death itself, but rather complete disappearance. Rome possessed an uncanny talent for making individuals vanish from public record without ever leaving a physical body behind. This systematic erasure was profoundly subtle. It required no cumbersome chains, no vigilant guards, and no potentially troublesome witnesses. Instead, it relied primarily on the diligent work of scribes. Roman historians, poets, and high-ranking officials meticulously controlled the prevailing narrative, and they wielded that immense power with generous, often devastating, effect. Queens who had once commanded formidable armies and vast territories were systematically reduced to mere brief mentions, distorted anecdotes, or vague, dismissive warnings concerning barbarian women. Their names were often deliberately misspelled, their achievements minimized, or their very existence entirely omitted from the official record. Rome did not outright deny the historical existence of these queens. Instead, it simply ensured that their presence held absolutely no significance or influence. This calculated strategy was far from accidental. Rome profoundly understood that memory itself constituted a formidable form of power. If people retained a clear and accurate memory of a ruler, they might also recall the reasons for their loyalty and allegiance. If, however, they were made to forget her, that loyalty would naturally dissolve on its own. Rome invariably preferred the quiet efficiency of forgetting, a method that required absolutely no deployment of troops. In certain instances, queens were so quietly and thoroughly absorbed into Roman life that history lost all trace of them altogether. They were systematically renamed, reassigned to new roles, married off into Roman families, or effectively converted into polite historical footnotes, living permanently under Roman supervision. Official records ceased to refer to them as queens, instead designating them merely as wives, daughters, or anonymous foreign women, thereby stripped of the very titles that had once rendered them formidable and threatening. Even in cases where queens were not entirely forgotten, Rome meticulously rewrote their very personalities. Their natural leadership was recast as overweening arrogance, their strategic brilliance redefined as impulsive recklessness, and their courageous resistance was ultimately condemned as sheer madness. Roman writers almost never depicted these women as genuinely competent or effective rulers. Such an admission would have subtly suggested that Rome had, in fact, faced legitimate and formidable opposition, a notion deemed utterly unacceptable. Instead, these queens were consistently portrayed as overly emotional, impulsively reactive, or inevitably doomed by their own insatiable ambition, the ancient world's equivalent of dismissively declaring, "This enterprise was never destined to succeed anyway." Rome's meticulously crafted version of history did not loudly proclaim its narratives. Instead, it artfully whispered them. Over the course of time, those subtle whispers gradually solidified into accepted truth. The most ingenious aspect of this erasure was that Rome made it appear entirely natural. Future generations simply assumed these queens were historically minor figures, precisely because Rome had carefully constructed their story in that manner. There were no grand monuments, no public celebrations, no names carved enduringly in stone, merely a pervasive and eloquent absence. For the queen, this insidious punishment extended far beyond the realm of physical death. Even her very memory was no longer hers to control or claim. She did not merely forfeit her throne, her freedom, or her life. She was systematically deprived of her rightful place in the annals of time. Rome did not always find it necessary to utterly destroy its enemies. Sometimes, it simply and efficiently edited them out of existence. And for an empire utterly obsessed with permanence, this represented the ultimate, most profound victory. Rome meticulously ensured that history was never left to chance. Instead, it deliberately employed a legion of writers. And these Roman writers, whether consciously aware of it or not, arguably served as some of the empire's most effective and enduring executioners. Once a captured queen had been thoroughly defeated, publicly humiliated, unjustly imprisoned, systematically erased from memory, or quietly killed, Roman authors seamlessly stepped in to complete the task. They required no physical chains or watchful guards. Their weapons were parchment and ink, and parchment, in its enduring legacy, proved far more resilient than fleeting fear. These Roman writers almost never depicted queens as genuinely capable leaders who posed a legitimate and substantial threat. Such an acknowledgement would have subtly implied that Rome had, in fact, faced serious and credible opposition, a notion that was considered utterly unacceptable to the imperial narrative. Instead, these queens were meticulously reframed as cautionary tales designed to deter future insurrections. Their innate courage was transmuted into reckless impulsivity. Their acute political skill was reinterpreted as insidious manipulation, and their courageous acts of resistance were summarily dismissed as mere hysteria. Rome did not engage in direct arguments against these women. Instead, it subtly, yet effectively, caricatured them. This insidious process was executed with a pervasive air of intellectual superiority, as Roman authors self-styled themselves as calm, rational, and objective observers meticulously describing irrational and unstable figures. The underlying implication was undeniably clear. Rome epitomized reason and order. Resistance, conversely, was nothing short of madness. If a queen dared to fight back, it was not attributed to her having strategic objectives or broad popular support. Instead, it was conveniently explained away as her being overly emotional, inherently unstable, or fatally doomed by her own excessive ambition. And because Rome exerted absolute control over education and the dissemination of knowledge, these distorted portrayals rapidly proliferated. Future scholars were taught exclusively Roman versions of historical events. Later, subsequent historians dutifully copied these established Roman sources. Consequently, the queens became precisely what Rome declared them to be, not because such portrayals were accurate, but simply because they were written first and repeated often. What rendered this form of historical revisionism particularly effective was its profound subtlety. Roman writers did not resort to screaming insults. Instead, they offered a dismissive sigh. They metaphorically shook their heads on the page, artfully framing the queen as an individual who might conceivably have succeeded, if only she had humbly recognized and accepted her predetermined place. Condescension, far more insidious than overt cruelty, effectively replaced it, making the resulting psychological damage appear entirely reasonable. Even seemingly positive praise, when it occasionally surfaced, was subtly poisonous. The queen might be described as brave, but solely to underscore the profound tragedy of her inevitable failure. She was perhaps clever, but fatally misguided, strong, yet unnaturally so. Such compliments, ultimately ending in the pronouncement of her inevitable doom, were not compliments at all. By the time centuries had elapsed, the queen was no longer recalled as a formidable ruler who had dared to challenge the might of Rome. Instead, she was remembered, if at all, as a fundamental mistake whose very existence served to prove Rome's imperial worldview correct and unassailable. Rome grasped something profoundly vital. While the act of killing a ruler might effectively quell resistance in the immediate present, the act of writing about them incorrectly served to prevent any future resistance. Thus, while soldiers, captured queens, and various Roman officials determined their immediate fate, it was ultimately the historians who ensured that those queens never truly recovered from their defeat. They did not merely lose their kingdoms, they suffered the indelible loss of their reputations. And within Rome's enduring empire, such a loss was, indeed, permanent and irretrievable. Rome never inflicted punishment upon captured queens purely for their own sake. Such an approach would have been deemed strategically inefficient. Instead, Rome meticulously punished them for the broader benefit of everyone else. Every chain applied, every triumphal parade staged, every carefully timed disappearance orchestrated, was aimed outward, serving as a powerful message, rather than inward retribution. The queen was, in essence, merely the delivery system for this imperial message. Empires, at their core, thrive and survive upon their reputation. Rome understood this fundamental truth implicitly. While its armies were undeniably formidable, its single greatest weapon was the powerful force of expectation. Kingdoms often surrendered not merely because Rome possessed the capability to win, but because Rome was universally expected to win. The calculated treatment of captured queens played a crucial role in maintaining and reinforcing that formidable expectation. When a foreign ruler observed a Roman triumph, their intended reaction was not one of mere curiosity. Instead, they were meant to engage in cold, hard calculation. If I resist, they were meant to ponder. This is how empires truly end. Not with a swift, decisive blow, nor a clean, unambiguous finish, but through a slow, agonizing public spectacle, meticulously documented with endless paperwork. Rome had a profound understanding that fear operates most effectively when it appears meticulously organized and justified. Random acts of brutality only breed chaos and unpredictable rebellion. However, systematic, calculated punishment invariably cultivates deep-seated obedience. The grim fate awaiting captured queens was far from some spontaneous, cruel impulse. It was, rather, a deliberate policy, artfully cloaked in the guise of inevitable consequence. This message was particularly aimed at other powerful rulers who commanded influence. Rome sought to make it unequivocally clear that high status offered no shield whatsoever. Royal lineage did not guarantee mercy, nor did noble titles afford any leverage to negotiate a more favorable outcome. In fact, these markers of prestige often exacerbated their punishment. The loftier one's position, the more protracted and thorough Rome's process of dismantling them became. And this stark message resonated, traveling far and wide. Merchants, moving across vast territories, carried hushed stories of these events. Diplomats, ever watchful, whispered the precise details in courtly circles. Roman writers, ever keen to serve the imperial narrative, embellished these accounts just enough to portray any form of resistance as utterly foolish and futile. Rome had no need to issue direct threats. It allowed the chilling example to speak for itself. There was also a subtle, unspoken warning intended for Rome's own allies. Unwavering loyalty would be handsomely rewarded, but any flicker of independence would be met with dire consequences. A queen who dared to step outside the bounds of Roman authority, even for the briefest moment, risked transforming into a cautionary tale. Cooperation, by stark comparison, suddenly appeared to be the far safer, more pragmatic choice. Rome seldom explicitly commanded, "Obey us." Instead, its silent decree was, "Look what befell her." And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this entire system was its chilling normalization. Over time, the systematic punishment of captured queens ceased to be viewed as extraordinary or shocking. It simply became an expected part of the imperial order. When another ruler inevitably fell, people no longer questioned what Rome would do, they merely wondered how long the grim process would take. Rome's ultimate success lay in its ability to make domination feel utterly predictable, and predictability, in turn, often feels terrifyingly permanent. Therefore, when Rome inflicted punishment upon captured queens, its motivations extended far beyond mere cruelty. It was, at its core, an intricate act of image maintenance, crafting a narrative that stretched far beyond the empire's physical borders and long outlasted the queen's individual lifetime. While she undeniably suffered, the true lesson was never intended for her. Ultimately, Rome did not punish captured queens because they were inherently weak. Rome punished them precisely because they were dangerous, even after their defeat. A ruling queen embodied an idea that Rome could never fully contain or control, a source of legitimate authority that did not originate within Rome and required no Roman approval. Empires can, by their very nature, tolerate external enemies. They can even grudgingly tolerate internal rebels. What they genuinely struggle to endure, however, are viable alternatives. A ruling queen, operating independently, crystallized the deeply uncomfortable possibility that genuine power could indeed exist outside Rome's meticulously constructed and managed hierarchy. She had governed without the imprimatur of Roman law, without the blessings of Roman gods, without the might of Roman armies, and without the tedious validation of Roman paperwork. People had willingly followed her, of their own accord. This single fact, on its own, was sufficiently unsettling to demand a swift and definitive correction. Rome was not insecure in its power, but it was exceptionally thorough. It harbored a deep aversion to loose ends, to unresolved symbols of defiance, and to any lingering doubts about its ultimate supremacy. A captured queen represented all three of these unacceptable anomalies. Leaving her unaddressed, unprocessed, or insufficiently humiliated ran the significant risk of inspiring precisely the wrong conclusions among Rome's subjects and rivals. Rome, above all else, preferred its lessons to be utterly unmistakable. So, it methodically dismantled queens, piece by agonizing piece. First their authority was stripped away, then their inherent dignity, then their remaining time, and finally, even their memory was assailed. Rome never rushed this process. It had no need to. It commanded centuries to relentlessly reinforce the same message, repeatedly, generation after generation. Resist, the message implicitly stated, and you will not merely lose. You will be publicly displayed, painstakingly delayed in your suffering, systematically erased from history, and thoroughly rewritten as a footnote to our glory. And herein lies a subtle, quiet irony. Rome's exceedingly harsh treatment of captured queens paradoxically reveals just how seriously it actually regarded them. Empires do not expend such vast energy humiliating opponents they deem insignificant. They reserve such concentrated effort for those formidable figures who might otherwise be remembered as legitimate, inspiring alternatives to their rule. Queens were punished with such meticulous care precisely because they truly mattered. Even Rome's own historians, in their attempts to diminish these women, unwittingly betrayed this underlying fear. The persistent need to belittle, distort, and diminish the stature of these women long after their deaths strongly suggests a deep anxiety within Rome, not a confident display of power. Rome desperately wanted future generations to believe these queens were inevitable failures, destined to fall, rather than brilliant leaders who had come perilously close to succeeding. And yet, remarkably, we still speak of them. Despite Rome's most concerted efforts, their stories endured, fragmented, distorted, incomplete, yet undeniably alive. Each remembered queen represents a nascent crack in Rome's carefully constructed narrative of its own inevitability. They are proof that resistance once existed, and that it was potent enough to deeply worry the most powerful empire of its age. Rome won the wars. Rome controlled the historical records. But Rome never fully managed to control memory itself. And perhaps, ultimately, that is its final, most profound failure. Because an empire that harbors such profound fear about how its enemies might be remembered reveals something deeply human beneath all its marble monuments and intricate laws. Even mighty Rome, at its core, was afraid of being challenged. Medieval London, while certainly not the genesis of crime, undeniably fostered an environment where it could comfortably flourish. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the city found itself bursting at the seams, with perhaps 80,000 souls crammed within the ancient Roman walls, structures never conceived to accommodate such a dense multitude of bodies, carts, animals, and burgeoning ambitions. The streets were notoriously narrow, winding, and frequently unnamed, a labyrinth of shadows and strange turns. Houses, with each new floor added, leaned precariously outwards, effectively blocking precious sunlight and trapping a pungent cocktail of odors. If one sought order, illumination, or personal space, they had decidedly chosen the wrong century in which to exist. Most Londoners not only lived but also toiled within the confines of the very same cramped building. A butcher might retire to a small room directly above his shop, while an alewife brewed, served, and raised her children all within the same smoky, bustling chamber. As night descended, shutters were drawn closed, candles cast flickering, uncertain light, and entire neighborhoods plunged into profound darkness. There were no public street lights. The moon's glow was a rare and precious luxury. Shadows, in this nocturnal realm, were ubiquitous, serving as excellent, silent accomplices to nefarious deeds. Crime thrived precisely because opportunities were constant and manifold. Crowded markets meant a steady supply of distracted customers. Pilgrims and foreign merchants arrived daily, often laden with purses full of coin and utterly disoriented by the city's unfamiliar layout. Taverns, after the curfew bell, spilled drunken men onto the dark, unpoliced streets. Apprentices, often as many as 10, slept huddled together in a single room. Servants, laden with goods, navigated alleys barely wide enough for two shoulders to pass. If one harbored an inclination to steal, profound skill was not the primary requirement. Rather, a keen sense of patience was all that was truly needed. London's very layout presented significant challenges for law enforcement. The city was meticulously divided into wards, each nominally responsible for its own policing efforts. This policing largely consisted of unpaid local men, serving night watch duty armed with staves and lanterns, assuming, of course, they managed to stay awake through their shifts. These were neighbors, not professional officers, and they possessed intimate knowledge of who lived where, a familiarity that frequently rendered law enforcement an awkward and complicated affair. Arresting an unknown stranger was one thing, apprehending a cousin or an uncle was an entirely different and far more delicate matter. Then, there was the imposing River Thames, which served simultaneously as London's bustling highway, its convenient dumping ground, and a ready escape route, all rolled into one vast waterway. Stolen goods, with alarming frequency, simply vanished onto waiting boats. Human bodies, too, occasionally found their final resting place in its currents. The bustling docks themselves were a magnet, drawing sailors, laborers, prostitutes, thieves, and gamblers in equal measure. In essence, wherever money flowed, crime inevitably followed. London also exerted a powerful magnetic pull. For anyone who was impoverished, utterly desperate, or fleeing from something, the city offered a tantalizing promise of work, anonymity, and a kind of chaotic freedom. For many, however, it delivered only gnawing hunger and overwhelming temptation. Theft was not always a deliberate career choice. More often, it manifested as a desperate, short-term survival strategy that, more often than not, spiraled disastrously out of control. In sum, medieval London was a cacophonous, foul-smelling, dangerously overcrowded, poorly lit, and loosely policed metropolis. It was not a city meticulously designed to prevent crime. Rather, it was a city that, almost quietly, invited crime to walk right in, shut the door behind it, and then largely pretended not to notice until someone inevitably screamed. If medieval London could be said to have a pervasive background noise, it was the subtle, insidious rustle of fingers reaching where they absolutely did not belong. Pickpocketing stood out as the most prevalent crime within the city and, simultaneously, the most notoriously difficult to curb. Crowds were an inescapable feature of daily life. Markets, churchyards, religious processions, public executions, and boisterous festivals, all these events packed people shoulder to shoulder in an immense human tide. And where bodies pressed together, hands invariably began to wander. The typical target of a pickpocket was not, as one might imagine, a fabulously wealthy noble. More commonly, it was the ordinary man, who, in the absence of banks, carried his entire day's or week's fortune openly on his belt. Coins were meticulously kept in small purses, secured with cords, and worn visibly for both convenience and sheer necessity. If you earned money, you carried it. And if you carried it, someone, somewhere, inevitably noticed. Cut purses were specialists, adept at stealthily removing these purses with small, razor-sharp knives, cleanly and quietly slicing the cords. The victim often remained entirely unaware of the theft until the telltale weight of their purse was simply gone. Some thieves operated as solitary figures, but a significant number worked in coordinated groups. One individual might deliberately bump into the target. Another would create a diversion, perhaps by shouting loudly or spilling ale. A third would then make the swift, silent cut. By the time the ensuing confusion began to subside, the stolen purse would have already changed hands, perhaps twice, making it incredibly difficult to trace. Children were, disturbingly, frequently involved in these operations. Orphans and runaways quickly learned that their small hands attracted considerably less suspicion. They were meticulously trained to watch for distracted merchants, inebriated sailors, or pilgrims whose attention was fixated on sacred relics rather than their own valuable belongings. If caught, these children might face a severe beating or be branded, yet many judges hesitated to impose the ultimate penalty of hanging. This grim reality made them disturbingly useful tools within an already brutal system. Markets, with their constant ebb and flow of people, served as prime hunting grounds. Buyers were engrossed in haggling for prices. Sellers were consumed by the pursuit of profit. Thieves, meanwhile, focused keenly on both. Church crowds, too, were equally tempting targets. Piety, it seemed, offered no protection for one's purse, and sermons about sin did little to deter an individual who hadn't eaten in days. Punishment for theft was largely dictated by the value of the stolen goods. Minor thefts might result in fines, time spent in the public stocks, or a public whipping. Larger sums, however, meant the perpetrator would face branding on the cheek or forehead, a permanent, indelible mark identifying them as a thief for the rest of their lives. Repeat offenders were subjected to mutilation, most commonly the loss of an ear or a hand. Hanging, the ultimate penalty, awaited at the very end of this grim path, a chilling spectacle visible to everyone and carefully remembered by all. Public shame was an integral, deliberate component of the justice system. Thieves were paraded through the crowded streets, mocked, spat upon, and sometimes even pelted with rotten food. The explicit goal was deterrence through profound humiliation, although, quite ironically, this brutal process frequently had the unintended effect of creating hardened, more desperate criminals instead. Despite these draconian measures, pickpocketing never truly vanished, it simply adapted. Thieves innovated, learning new, more sophisticated tricks. Londoners, in turn, learned to clutch their purses ever tighter. The city, in its pragmatic resignation, eventually accepted pickpocketing as an inherent part of daily life, much like the mud clinging to their boots or the smoke hanging in the air. In medieval London, losing one's money was not a shocking occurrence. It was, grimly, expected. Taverns served as medieval London's primary venues for relaxation, which is precisely why they frequently became hotbeds of trouble. Ale was inexpensive, generally safer to drink than the dubious water supply, and consumed in truly heroic quantities. By sunset, many taverns were already boisterously loud. By nightfall, they had often transformed into genuinely dangerous places. Drink loosened tongues, blurred the lines of loyalty, and quickly escalated minor insults into serious matters of honor that, in the prevailing culture, absolutely demanded resolution with fists. Most tavern brawls ignited over trivialities hardly worth remembering: a spilled cup, a disputed dice throw, or a perceived slight to a woman who may or may not have even been present. Once voices began to rise in anger, others would quickly join the fray, driven either by a misguided sense of loyalty, sheer boredom, or simply the primal joy of descending into chaos. Benches, overturned, swiftly became impromptu weapons. Heavy tankards flew through the air. Knives, it was often later admitted, appeared far faster than anyone truly wished to acknowledge. Weapons, in general, were commonplace. Men routinely carried daggers, valuing them as essential tools as much as defensive arms. Apprentices were legally forbidden from carrying swords, a prohibition that seldom deterred them. Sailors, fresh from the docks, brought their own formidable knives. Even a broken bottle or a sturdy fire poker could swiftly turn lethal. A brawl that commenced with angry shouting could easily conclude with a lifeless body on the tavern floor, with no clear idea of who had delivered the final, fatal blow. Street violence often followed as an ugly postscript. When taverns shuttered their doors at the ringing of the curfew bell, inebriated patrons would spill out into the alleys, which were already cloaked in darkness and notoriously narrow. Fights, undeterred, frequently continued outside, sometimes drawing in watchmen who were just as likely to be attacked as they were to be offered assistance. Night watch patrols were poorly paid and inadequately trained. Many, understandably, preferred to shout warnings from a safe distance rather than intervene directly in a dangerous altercation. The law, while theoretically treating violence seriously, applied punishments unevenly. If no one died, penalties ranged from modest fines to a stint in the pillory. Serious injuries, however, could lead to imprisonment. Homicide, naturally, complicated matters significantly. Killing in self-defense was, in theory, excusable, but proving such a claim was exceedingly difficult. Witnesses were often either drunk, heavily biased, or conveniently absent from the scene. Guild rivalries also served as a persistent source of violence. Apprentices from different trades clashed regularly, especially during lively festivals. Bakers might brawl with butchers. Fishmongers seemed to fight just about everyone. These were not random, isolated skirmishes. Rather, they were often expressions of deeply ingrained identity, fiercely held loyalty, and long-standing grudges carried out with surprising enthusiasm and very little forethought. Authorities sporadically attempted crackdowns, imposing strict curfews and banning weapons from taverns, but enforcement was consistently inconsistent and ultimately ineffective. Tavern owners, after all, relied heavily on their rowdy customers for their livelihoods. Watchmen, on the other hand, depended on not getting stabbed during their patrols. In the final analysis, tavern violence was largely tolerated because it was so utterly familiar, a predictable part of the urban landscape. As long as it remained, for the most part, within certain understood bounds, London simply accepted bruises, broken bones, and the occasional corpse as the unavoidable price of being a vibrant city where people congregated nightly to drink and socialize. Medieval London, despite its official disapproval of prostitution, quietly relied upon it as an integral part of its urban fabric. Brothels were begrudgingly considered a necessary evil, a pragmatic means to avert what was deemed worse sins by channeling male desire into officially regulated spaces. The city did not outright ban them. Instead, it pursued a policy of attempting to control them, which inherently meant accepting that sex work was an undeniable component of urban life, provided it remained confined to areas where authorities could visibly monitor it. Most legal brothels were strategically concentrated in specific districts, notably Southwark, situated across the River Thames. This area, conveniently, fell under a different jurisdiction, placing it effectively outside the direct administrative control of London's civic authorities. These licensed brothels paid regular fees, adhered to a set of specific rules, and submitted to periodic inspections. Prostitutes were mandated to wear distinct, identifying clothing so they could not possibly be mistaken for honest women, a crucial distinction that carried immense weight both in the courts and on the bustling streets. Despite these regulations, brothel raids were a common occurrence. Officials would periodically stage moral crackdowns, often timed during periods of political instability or heightened religious pressure. These raids were less about genuinely eradicating prostitution and more about overtly demonstrating the authorities' power and moral standing. Women were routinely arrested, fined, publicly shamed, or briefly imprisoned, only to be released back into the very same system that had just punished them. Clients, notably, were rarely targeted. Men caught during these raids were typically issued a mere warning or, more often, entirely ignored, unless they happened to be clergy, married individuals of standing, or politically inconvenient figures. Thus, the heavy burden of morality fell almost entirely upon the women, particularly those who lacked powerful protectors. Illegal brothels also thrived, operating covertly. Some functioned discreetly out of taverns, bathhouses, or private residences. Others were little more than humble rooms rented by the night. These illicit spaces offered no protection and were consequently far more vulnerable to violence, theft, and rampant exploitation. Prostitutes working in these illegal establishments could be beaten, robbed, or arrested with virtually no legal recourse. Sex-related crimes extended beyond the purview of prostitution itself. Adultery, fornication, and sodomy were all considered offenses subject to punishment, though enforcement depended heavily on the availability of credible witnesses and the accused's reputation. Accusations, even unsubstantiated ones, possessed the power to irrevocably destroy lives. A woman's testimony carried significantly less weight than a man's, and the word of a poor woman barely registered in the legal system at all. Punishments for these transgressions ranged from fines and public penance to periods of imprisonment. In severe or repeated cases, banishment from the city was a distinct possibility. Public shame, once again, was the preferred weapon in the authorities' arsenal. Offenders were paraded through the streets, publicly named, and explicitly marked as moral failures, their reputations permanently damaged beyond repair. Brothel raids, in essence, provided a superficial appearance of moral order while fundamentally changing very little of the underlying reality. The city, despite its pronouncements, needed sex workers. Sailors needed their distractions. And officials, quite frankly, needed the revenue. Crime, in this particular instance, was not something medieval London genuinely wished to eliminate. It simply sought to manage it quietly, preferably without ever openly admitting how deeply dependent it truly was on its continued existence. Theft in medieval London was more than just a crime. It was a looming public spectacle, constantly waiting for its moment to erupt. The city held a profound belief in the power of highly visible punishment. Justice, they believed, was meant to be seen, deeply remembered, and universally feared. If someone stole, the ultimate goal was never rehabilitation. It was a stark, unforgettable warning. Petty theft, encompassing the stealing of bread, tools, or clothing, was alarmingly common, particularly during harsh winters or periods of severe food shortages. Courts, while acknowledging the desperation that often drove such acts, rarely offered any excuse for them. A first-time offender might initially face a fine or a public whipping. If they were unable to pay the fine, which, for most, was an insurmountable obstacle, the punishment inevitably became physical. Pain, in essence, replaced money as the primary currency of justice. Branding was especially dreaded. A searing hot iron pressed into the cheek, forehead, or hand indelibly marked a thief for life. This permanent mark vocally announced their crime to prospective employers, neighbors, and strangers alike. Once branded, the prospect of finding honest, respectable work became virtually impossible, a cruel consequence that paradoxically encouraged a cycle of repeat offending. The very system designed to deter criminals often, in effect, created them. More serious thefts escalated to the horrifying sanction of mutilation. Ears were brutally cut off. Hands were severed. These punishments were not only legally sanctioned but also highly ritualized and performed publicly, before an expectant crowd. The onlookers watched, not solely for entertainment, but explicitly for instruction. Children were deliberately brought along to learn the severe consequences of crime early in life. Execution awaited at the far, most extreme end of the punitive scale. Hanging was the customary method, carried out at notorious sites such as Tyburn. Theft exceeding a certain value, or a pattern of repeated offenses, could send an individual directly to the gallows. Disturbingly, the threshold for a capital theft was remarkably low. The theft of a simple coat, a small purse, or even a few coins could be enough to warrant the death penalty. This pervasive fear profoundly shaped daily behavior. Londoners meticulously locked their chests, diligently hid their valuables, and made sure to travel in groups for safety. Shops installed robust shutters and iron bars for protection. People consciously memorized faces, particularly those of known criminals circulating in their neighborhoods. Rumors, often exaggerating the dangers, spread like wildfire, transforming anonymous strangers into potential threats. Yet, amidst this harshness, public punishment also, unexpectedly, bred sympathy. Crowds, at times, would pray fervently for the condemned. Occasionally, they would even intervene, cutting down a hanging body prematurely in desperate hopes of resuscitation and survival. Executions were undeniably terrifying spectacles, but they were also profound communal events, a strange and unsettling blend of raw justice, religious ritual, and an uneasy, often unspoken compassion. Authorities firmly believed that harsh punishment was essential to preserve order. In reality, it largely succeeded in creating a city perpetually tense with anxiety. Theft never truly vanished. It simply adapted. Criminals becoming faster, quieter, and more selective. Common citizens found themselves living in a constant state of heightened awareness, perpetually suspicious, and always bracing for the loss of everything they possessed due to a single, unguarded moment. In medieval London, fear wasn't merely an unfortunate byproduct of criminal activity, it was an intrinsic component of the city's very fabric. It was meticulously cultivated, overtly showcased, and profoundly experienced by every individual who navigated the streets carrying anything of value. As dusk settled over medieval London, the city didn't merely drift into slumber, it yielded, almost completely, to the encroaching night. Darkness dramatically reshaped once familiar thoroughfares, rendering them perilous and utterly unpredictable territory. Devoid of effective street lighting, the only illumination came from the scattered points of light offered by candles and hearthfires, most of which were deliberately extinguished early by households eager to conserve precious resources. The consequence was a city where oppressive shadows held sway and criminal acts surged exponentially. Nighttime proved to be the hour when theft grew audacious. Burglars brazenly targeted private homes and commercial establishments, systematically prying open shutters, forcibly breaking down doors, or clandestinely slipping through any window left unattended. Even hallowed churches offered no sanctuary. These sacred spaces, rich with valuable vessels, candles, and pious offerings, were equally vulnerable. And when driven by the stark realities of hunger or the powerful pull of greed, thieves seldom hesitated, casting aside any concern for divine retribution. Committing sacrilege was indeed unlawful, yet for many, it presented a disturbingly lucrative opportunity. To impose some semblance of order, the city depended on its night watch. These were not dedicated professionals but local men compelled to serve out of civic obligation rather than any genuine desire. They were either unpaid entirely or received meager wages, possessed inadequate equipment, and were often composed of the elderly or the largely inexperienced. Armed with simple staves and lanterns, they ambled through their assigned wards in small groups, dutifully announcing the passing hours and ostensibly searching for suspicious activities. While this was the theoretical ideal, in practical reality, many watchmen often dozed off, indulged in drink, or consciously sidestepped any direct confrontation. Facing armed brigands in the labyrinthine narrow alleys was inherently perilous, and there was scant motivation for a watchman to display heroism. A watchman wounded in the line of duty received no compensation, while a fallen one merited little more than prayers. Criminals were acutely aware of these realities, treating the night watch more as a minor inconvenience than a genuine deterrent. Curfews, despite their official pronouncements, were applied inconsistently. Bells solemnly chimed to signify the cessation of legitimate movement, yet taverns, brothels, and private assemblies routinely disregarded these mandates. Anyone apprehended outdoors past curfew might face questioning or detention, but the rigor of enforcement largely hinged on one's social standing. Reputable merchants typically navigated such encounters with greater ease than did humble servants or foreign visitors. Furthermore, the shroud of night provided perfect cover for violence. Assaults, robberies, and murders became significantly more challenging to investigate in the profound darkness. Witnesses often vanished without a trace, and crucial evidence evaporated. Consequently, countless cases remained unresolved, consigned to history as mere rumors or enigmatic, unexplained deaths. The Thames itself, it seemed, was adept at swallowing secrets without a trace. The city did periodically attempt reforms, deploying more watchmen, implementing stricter curfews, and providing improved equipment. Yet none of these measures managed to resolve the fundamental issue. London was simply too vast, too enveloped in darkness, and too densely populated for any truly effective nighttime control. For the average citizen, night was synonymous with inherent danger. Doors were heavily barred, windows firmly shuttered, and families huddled together within the supposed safety of their homes. Travel after dark was scrupulously avoided unless absolutely essential. Those who did venture through the city at night did so with a specific purpose, fueled by fear, or often, a potent combination of both. In medieval London, daylight inherently belonged to the rule of law and the vibrancy of commerce. Night, however, was the domain of illicit opportunity, gnawing desperation, and the silent, pervasive understanding that once darkness descended, assistance was tenuous, and true justice would inevitably have to defer until the break of dawn. Medieval London's prisons bore little resemblance to modern penal institutions primarily designed for punishment. Instead, they functioned largely as grim holding pens, intended to confine individuals until a verdict could be rendered and a final decision reached. The wheels of justice turned with agonizing slowness, and during this prolonged waiting period, prisoners languished in conditions that frequently proved more brutal than any eventual sentence itself. The most notorious of these establishments was Newgate, a name whose mere utterance was enough to instill profound terror. Inmates were forced to pay for every necessity, their meager food, their straw bedding, the very chains that bound them, and even the eventual removal of those chains. Naturally, those with financial means experienced marginally better conditions, while the indigent endured unimaginable suffering. Hunger, pervasive filth, and rampant disease were constant, inescapable companions. Rats scurried freely through the squalor, as did infestations of lice. Debtors, common thieves, individuals suspected of murder, and political prisoners were all indiscriminately intermingled. There was scant segregation based on the nature of their alleged crime, their age, or their gender. Violence within these prison walls was distressingly commonplace, and guards often turned a blind eye to such brutality, unless, of course, a suitable bribe changed their perspective. Ultimately, survival within these confines hinged on a combination of personal connections, physical strength, or sheer, unpredictable luck. The administration of justice relied almost entirely on direct accusation and verbal testimony. Investigations were notoriously brief and superficial, and the evidence presented was frequently circumstantial, lacking definitive proof. Juries were typically comprised of local men, many of whom might have already known either the accused or the victim, introducing significant potential for bias. Indeed, reputation held enormous sway. A known troublemaker was far more readily condemned than a respected member of a guild, often irrespective of the actual facts of the case. While trials themselves could proceed quickly once commenced, actually reaching that stage often consumed considerable time. Prisoners consequently endured weeks or even months of agonizing uncertainty, never knowing if they would face a fine, be maimed, banished, or summarily executed. This pervasive anxiety, in itself, became an insidious component of their punishment. Confessions, while crucial, were sometimes elicited through intense psychological pressure rather than outright physical force, though it is worth noting that explicit torture remained comparatively rare in England compared to other parts of Europe. Yet not all justice dispensed was uniformly harsh. Courts occasionally demonstrated clemency, particularly towards first-time offenders or those who could garner strong support from their community. Pardons were a tangible possibility, often graciously granted during significant religious festivals or grand royal celebrations, injecting an unpredictable element of charity into an otherwise cruel system. Public trust in the justice system, however, remained profoundly fragile. While some citizens perceived the courts as indispensable protectors of order, others viewed them primarily as instruments wielded by the powerful elite. Corruption was not merely present, it was an open, widely acknowledged secret. Bribes possessed the power to commute severe sentences, and sufficient influence could entirely erase charges. The impoverished understood with stark clarity that the law was anything but blind. It scrutinized one's social standing with intense precision. Prisons perfectly embodied this inherent imbalance, effectively punishing poverty as much as they did actual crime. For a great many, the sheer act of being incarcerated, irrespective of the trial's ultimate outcome, irrevocably destroyed their livelihood, fractured their families, and extinguished any hope for a future. In medieval London, therefore, justice transcended a simple binary of guilt or innocence. It was fundamentally a test of sheer endurance. If one managed to survive the interminable waiting, the pervasive filth, and the gnawing fear, any sentence that eventually followed might almost be welcomed as a conclusion, bringing a perverse form of relief, rather than perceived as a new beginning of hardship. Execution day in medieval London was a far cry from a quiet, solemn, or private affair. On the contrary, it was a boisterous, densely crowded, and even disturbingly festive public spectacle. As soon as news circulated that an individual was scheduled for hanging, people would pour out en masse to witness it. Vendors plied their wares, selling food and drink, while children scrambled onto any available perch to secure a better view. What was ostensibly intended to instill profound fear often, strangely, devolved into a form of macabre entertainment. Most executions occurred at designated sites, such as the infamous Tyburn, situated just beyond the city limits. Condemned prisoners were paraded through the very streets, sometimes bound to a hurdle or cart, deliberately allowing ample time for the throngs to assemble. This solemn procession held immense significance. It transformed the act of punishment into a highly visible moral lesson, a final, step-by-step warning publicly delivered to all. Hanging remained the customary method, particularly for thieves, being simple, economical, and highly public. Death was by no means always swift. Short drops frequently resulted in agonizingly slow strangulation. The gathered crowd observed every detail, with some jeering, others murmuring prayers, and a few even shouting encouragement, hoping the condemned would offer a repentance loud enough to perhaps save their soul, if not their mortal body. Execution served as a potent reinforcement of social order, showcasing criminals as stark cautionary examples rather than figures of tragedy. Yet, despite this intended effect, an undercurrent of sympathy often permeated the crowd. Many of those condemned were conspicuously young, impoverished, or palpably terrified. Mothers would faint, and friends would openly weep. Occasionally, the crowd itself would intervene, pulling on the legs of the condemned to expedite death, a macabre act of grim mercy. In particularly egregious or notorious cases, bodies were sometimes left hanging for hours, or even days. This prolonged display was designed to extend the moral lesson, with the sight of decaying corpses literally marking the boundary between established law and encroaching chaos. Londoners thus learned not only where not to tread physically, but also where not to stray morally. However, not all executions were meted out equally. Nobles convicted of serious offenses might instead face beheading, a swifter and ostensibly cleaner death that spared them the indignity of the rope. Thus, one's social status undeniably followed them all the way to the scaffold. Even in the finality of death, hierarchy demonstrably mattered. Religious rituals often served to temper the harshness of the moment. Priests would offer prayers, and the condemned were gently encouraged to make their confessions. A final speech, if delivered eloquently, could garner respect or even forgiveness from the onlookers, whereas a defiant statement might incite public hatred. These last words carried significant weight, for they were meticulously remembered, frequently repeated, and occasionally even transcribed for posterity. Execution days ultimately laid bare a profound contradiction at the core of medieval justice. The city authorities yearned for fear, order, and obedience, yet simultaneously, the populace craved spectacle and drama. Punishment, in this context, was an intricate fusion of law, theater, and morality play. For ordinary Londoners, the gallows were hardly abstract threats. They were starkly familiar landmarks within their daily lives. Everyone, it seemed, knew someone, a family member, a friend, an acquaintance, who had stood upon that very platform, awaiting their fate. Crime, therefore, concluded lives publicly, loudly, and in full, unsparing view, ensuring that no one ever truly forgot the absolute demands the city imposed in its relentless pursuit of order. In medieval London, crime wasn't merely an interruption to the flow of daily life. It was an intricately woven thread within its very fabric. People harbored no illusions of safety in the contemporary sense. Instead, they anticipated constant risk, potential loss, and the unceasing necessity to remain vigilant. True survival entailed adapting ingeniously rather than overtly resisting the pervasive dangers. Londoners developed these vital habits from an early age. Purses, for instance, were meticulously tied shut and tucked discreetly beneath clothing whenever feasible. Doors were secured with heavy bars precisely at dusk. Neighbors instinctively listened for the sound of unfamiliar footsteps in the night, and strangers were observed with intense scrutiny, particularly within the bustling confines of markets and taverns. Trust did exist, certainly, but it was always exercised with profound caution and remained strictly conditional. Indeed, communities often policed themselves as effectively, if not more so, than the official legal apparatus. Reputation held immense weight. A known thief would invariably find doors closed against him and opportunities for work virtually non-existent. Gossip and rumor, in that era, traveled with far greater speed and impact than any formal warnings. Yet, concurrently, these same tight-knit communities often acted to protect their own. Witnesses might occasionally prevaricate under oath, and juries frequently hesitated to condemn neighbors they personally knew, even when the evidence of guilt seemed overwhelmingly obvious. In such instances, justice visibly yielded to the pressures of familiarity. Fear fundamentally shaped the contours of social behavior. Women learned to avoid certain streets when alone, while merchants invariably traveled in guarded groups. Apprentices swiftly acquired essential knowledge, discerning which taverns offered relative safety and which ones demanded an exit before the full onset of night. Parents instructed their children not with abstract moral precepts, but with chillingly tangible, real-world examples. Everyone in London knew the names of the recently executed. Everyone knew precisely where those grim spectacles had transpired. While religion steadfastly framed crime as a moral sin, the stark reality of hunger frequently reframed it as an absolute necessity. Consequently, many individuals who committed crimes did not perceive themselves as inherent villains. They were often desperate laborers unable to find employment, servants unjustly dismissed without their rightful wages, or rootless migrants lacking any social connections. London, in a cruel paradox, lured them with the promise of opportunity only to then brutally punish them for daring to believe in it. The authorities, to some extent, understood this underlying tension, but they rarely moved to address its root causes. Imposing harsh punishment was invariably easier than enacting meaningful social reform, and public executions proved far more economical than providing welfare. In essence, the city consistently prioritized instilling fear over offering practical solutions, and favored dramatic spectacle over fostering genuine stability. Yet, despite this pervasive darkness and danger, London demonstrably endured. Trade continued unabated, taverns remained bustling, and markets briskly reopened the very day after an execution. Crime, rather than utterly destroying the city, profoundly shaped its character. The relentless, day-to-day negotiation between ever-present danger and the tenuous attempts at order forged a populace that was resilient, inherently suspicious, and profoundly practical. Medieval Londoners lived with the chilling knowledge that the very rules designed to protect them one day could, with alarming swiftness, destroy them the next. Law was palpably visible, violence overtly public, and survival hinged far more on constant awareness than on abstract innocence. In its essence, crime in medieval London was not an anomaly or an aberration. It was an inevitable consequence of demographic density, widespread poverty, the stark realities of opportunity, and the enduring complexities of human nature, all playing out in narrow, winding streets beneath the shadows of leaning houses, observed by neighbors who understood with chilling precision just how fragile safety truly was. Vercingetorix entered a world of inherent power long before he ever conceived of rebellion. His people, the Arverni, were by no means a minor Gallic tribe secluded in remote forests and hills. On the contrary, they stood as one of the preeminent and dominant forces of Central Gaul, a confederation renowned for its wealth, its formidable military prowess, and an unyielding pride in its distinguished lineage. To be born into the Arverni nobility meant growing up enveloped by an atmosphere of authority, pervasive expectation, and constant, subtle reminders of the grand individual you were destined to become. His own family occupied a position near the apex of this intricate social hierarchy. His father, Sultillus, was far from an ordinary chieftain. He wielded sufficient influence to openly aspire to kingship, a profoundly dangerous ambition within a Gallic world that inherently distrusted centralized power and autocratic rule. Among the Arverni, leadership was a complex affair, shared, meticulously negotiated, and perpetually contested. Any man who dared to reach too high risked being branded a tyrant by his own people. From his earliest childhood, Vercingetorix would have been thoroughly immersed in the ethos of a warrior aristocracy. Within this society, true status was not conferred by mere paperwork or formal titles, but rather undeniably proven through acts of courage, profound generosity, and unwavering loyalty. Young boys from noble families were rigorously raised to master the arts of fighting, riding, and hunting, and to endure pain and hardship without uttering a single complaint. While raw strength was greatly admired, a disciplined restraint was considered equally vital. A prospective leader required as much calculated discipline as they did untamed ferocity. He spent his formative years hearing the names of revered ancestors spoken with deep reverence, their heroic deeds recounted during elaborate feasts where meat was ceremoniously carved and honor was distributed alongside the food. These gatherings were more than mere celebrations. They were potent lessons. Each narrative meticulously reinforced the profound idea that nobility carried with it weighty obligations, to fiercely defend one's people, to scrupulously uphold ancient traditions, and never to forget past slights. The world of the Arverni was intensely political, a complex web where alliances constantly shifted and rival clans observed one another with meticulous suspicion. Even within the supposedly secure confines of noble families, loyalty itself could fracture dramatically under external pressure. Vercingetorix would have swiftly learned, even as a young man, that power was an inherently fragile construct and that public admiration could easily sour into deep suspicion overnight. And then, there was the burgeoning presence of Rome. Not yet an outright occupying force during his childhood, Rome was an increasingly significant presence in the tales told, the goods traded, and the rumors that spread. Distant, yet undeniably looming, Rome was described as immensely wealthy, astonishingly disciplined, and dangerously organized. For a young Arvernian noble, Rome represented both an intriguing curiosity and a potent, unsettling warning. Vercingetorix's very birth positioned him within a societal system that prioritized strength, collective memory, and fiercely guarded independence above all other virtues. He was raised not to conform quietly, but to lead with conviction and a strong voice. That foundational identity, meticulously forged long before he ever gripped a sword in battle, would ultimately dictate every significant choice he would make, particularly when the powerful forces of loyalty, survival, and vengeance inevitably converged. Vercingetorix matured in a world where the power of memory far surpassed the permanence of ink. Among the Arverni, while a form of writing did exist, it was not deemed trustworthy enough to embody the very soul of the people. Instead, their laws, their intricate history, and their collective identity were conveyed through spoken voices, not static pages. To forget, within this culture, was to forfeit one's very sense of self. To remember was considered a profound and sacred duty. As a child, Vercingetorix would have spent far more time listening intently than he ever did reading. Elders painstakingly recited genealogies that stretched back countless generations, meticulously naming warriors, chieftains, and long-vanished rivals who, though dead, remained vividly present through these enduring stories. These weren't merely distant legends. They were potent reminders that the living were but temporary custodians of an immensely ancient legacy. Each and every name carried significant weight and inherent expectations. Bards, in this society, wielded enormous influence. They concurrently fulfilled the roles of historians, moral arbiters, and captivating entertainers. At celebratory feasts, they would sing evocative tales of hard-won victories and bitter betrayals, eloquently praising acts of generosity, while sharply mocking displays of cowardice. Their carefully chosen words possessed the power to dramatically elevate a man's public reputation or, conversely, to subtly and irrevocably ruin it. Young nobles, like Vercingetorix, paid exceptionally close attention, understanding that a future leader vitally needed to comprehend how narratives effectively shaped and cemented power. These ritual feasts themselves functioned as profound classrooms. Meat was meticulously divided according to social rank, with every single portion imbued with symbolic meaning. Who received the choicest cut was never accidental. Children absorbed the intricate nuances of hierarchy not through explicit lectures, but by keen observation. They watched, they remembered, and they silently absorbed the unwritten rules. Mistakes were keenly noticed, and often, silence conveyed more potent correction than any spoken rebuke. Druids also profoundly shaped education, albeit in an indirect manner. They served as the revered keepers of religious law and the cosmic order, figures who commanded both immense respect and deep fear. Noble children were introduced to their teachings not through formal classroom instruction, but through the immersive experience of ritual, adherence to taboo, and the powerful influence of moral example. The fundamental concept that the world operated under a delicate governance of unseen balances took firm root from an early age. Training the mind was considered every bit as crucial as training the body. Boys were expected to rigorously memorize lengthy speeches, complex poems, and intricate legal precedents. This rigorous exercise not only sharpened their memory, but also instilled profound discipline. A leader who proved incapable of accurately recalling past promises, remembered insults, or existing alliances was, by definition, deemed unfit to govern. Rome, in stark contrast, meticulously committed everything to writing: contracts, military orders, civil laws. Gallic elites were well aware of this Roman practice and often regarded it with considerable suspicion. They perceived that writing solidified and fixed power in rigid ways that their fluid, tradition-based society inherently resisted. For Vercingetorix, the pervasive oral culture powerfully reinforced the values of flexibility, personal loyalty, and individual honor, placing them above any abstract or impersonal authority. By the time he reached adolescence, Vercingetorix was already profoundly shaped by a culture that held a deep conviction that words possessed the power to bind warriors and that memory itself was a formidable weapon. Long before he would ever stand against the formidable Roman legions on the battlefield, he had already learned to wage battles of narrative, identity, and profound meaning. These lessons, he would discover, would ultimately prove every bit as crucial as any blade. Among the Arverni, childhood was a remarkably brief phase. By the time Vercingetorix was capable of running, he was already being assessed and prepared for the demanding life of a warrior. Strength, physical endurance, and unwavering courage were not merely desirable attributes. They constituted the very social currency through which status and respect were earned. A noble boy who demonstrated an inability to fight was not merely considered weak. He was, quite frankly, a significant liability to his family and his people. Physical training commenced at an exceedingly early age and was relentlessly constant. Young boys were engaged in wrestling matches, foot races, and extensive hunts throughout the dense forests and rugged hills of central Gaul. These were never mere games. They were rigorous exercises designed to impart crucial balance, cultivate a high tolerance for pain, and instill an understanding of teamwork. Injuries were an anticipated part of this demanding regimen, and any complaints were actively discouraged. It was through sheer endurance that respect was earned, long before one reached adulthood. Weapons were introduced progressively, initially spears and shields, followed later by swords. Young nobles were rigorously trained in formation fighting, mastering the critical skills of holding their ground, effectively protecting their comrades, and advancing resolutely under intense pressure. While individual bravery was undoubtedly valued, unwavering loyalty was considered paramount. A warrior who faltered or broke ranks risked endangering every single person in his unit. Hunting served a dual purpose, functioning as an essential form of military preparation. Tracking elusive prey sharpened one's patience and tactical thinking, while the act of the kill itself tested one's resolve and courage. The feast that often followed a successful hunt profoundly reinforced the value of generosity. A skilled hunter was expected to share his bounty widely, not selfishly hoard it. Indeed, one's reputation grew significantly through acts of giving, not through accumulation. Vercingetorix would have meticulously observed older warriors, men whose bodies bore scars openly, tangible proof of their survival in battle and their earned honor. Stories of past battles were recounted ceaselessly, highlighting moments of both extraordinary courage and bitter betrayal. These narratives functioned as much as stark warnings against folly as they did powerful inspirations for future glory. Discipline within this society was primarily social rather than institutional. Shame proved a far more effective enforcer of proper behavior than any formal punishment. Cowardice was remembered long and vividly, while bravery was loudly celebrated. A man's public reputation, once established, followed him relentlessly everywhere. For a young noble like Vercingetorix, this pervasive social dynamic created an unceasing pressure to perform commendably in all aspects of life. Training also encompassed vital ritual elements. Before embarking on battle or significant hunts, solemn offerings were made to the gods, and sacred oaths were fervently sworn. Warriors believed they were bound not only to each other in earthly covenants, but also to a pantheon of gods and the watchful eyes of their revered ancestors. Failure, therefore, transcended the personal realm. It became a spiritual failing. In these crucial lessons, the shadow of Rome consistently reappeared. Roman soldiers were depicted as models of discipline, relentlessly advancing, and frighteningly organized in their formations. While GIC warriors admired their formidable strength, they simultaneously disdained the inflexible rigidity that defined Roman military structure. To truly embody the GIC spirit was to prioritize personal valor and individual freedom, even when such ideals demanded a heavy sacrifice. By the cusp of adolescence, Vercingetorix had deeply ingrained a warrior identity forged through severe physical hardship, the weight of public expectation, and profound sacred obligations. He was not merely being trained to fight battles but to command unwavering loyalty. This rigorous upbringing, however, would soon be shattered by an impending collision with betrayal, profound loss, and a pivotal lesson that would ultimately shape his destiny far more significantly than any battlefield triumph. For Vercingetorix, the most defining lesson of his formative years did not emerge from the arduous physical training or the solemn tribal rituals. Instead, it stemmed from observing power's insidious tendency to turn inward and ultimately consume itself. His own father, Cautilus, met his end not at the hands of foreign enemies, but through execution by his fellow Gauls. This singular, stark reality profoundly influenced everything that followed in Vercingetorix's life. Cautilus had been a prominent Arvernian noble, wielding sufficient influence to attempt what few others dared, the ambitious restoration of kingship among his people. The Arverni had, in a prior age, extended their rule widely, but the lingering memories of that domination had since bred deep-seated suspicion among other Gallic tribes. GIC elites harbored a pervasive fear of any individual who amassed excessive authority, convinced that kingship inevitably invited tyranny and destructive civil war. Whether Cautilus genuinely sought absolute power or merely aimed for greater unity among the Gauls remains historically ambiguous. What undeniably mattered, however, was public perception. Rival nobles quickly accused him of overweening ambition, blatant betrayal, and a dangerous consolidation of influence. In a society that deeply prized shared leadership and consensus, such actions were deemed unforgivable. The punishment inflicted was both public and brutally severe. Cautilus was executed by his own people, a deliberate, stark act intended to serve as a potent warning to others against harboring similar aspirations. For the wider community, it was upheld as justice. For his grieving family, it was utter devastation. Vercingetorix, though still young, was old enough to comprehend the horror of what had transpired. His father's once-honored name became dangerous to even utter aloud. Former allies quickly distanced themselves, and the family's esteemed position collapsed virtually overnight. Nobility, it became terrifyingly clear, offered no guarantee of protection, and loyalty was revealed to be conditional, fragile. This pivotal moment imparted upon Vercingetorix a lesson far more potent and enduring than any battle drill. It taught him that power, devoid of unity, inevitably invites its own destruction. His father had not fallen to the might of Rome. He had succumbed to the corrosive forces of fear, jealousy, and fractured leadership within his own ranks. The execution also instilled within Vercingetorix a quiet, yet persistent, bitterness. The very society that had preached and demanded loyalty had, in a brutal twist, betrayed one of its own. Honor, he realized, proved fragile, justice, overtly political. From this dramatic point forward, Vercingetorix lived with an acute sense of contradiction. He was born to lead, yet leadership itself had utterly destroyed his father. He had been raised to implicitly trust his people, yet they had collectively killed their own chief. Rome, still distant but inexorably growing in strength, now loomed differently in his consciousness. Where GIC unity had catastrophically failed, Roman order, in contrast, endured with unwavering strength. This stark dichotomy planted dangerous, unsettling ideas within him. Perhaps the true enemy was not external foreign domination, but rather internal division and discord. Cautilus' death did not immediately transform Vercingetorix into an overt rebel, but it irrevocably stripped away his youthful innocence. It taught him that mere courage was insufficient for survival. True survival demanded astute control of loyalty, masterful manipulation of narrative, and the strategic deployment of fear. That indelible lesson would remain with him long after his childhood years concluded, profoundly shaping his future approach to uniting disparate tribes, ruthlessly punishing dissent, and ultimately accepting that rebellion, much like leadership itself, demanded immense and often brutal sacrifice. Following the brutal execution of Cautilus, Vercingetorix did not inherit his father's considerable influence. Instead, he inherited his danger, a precarious legacy. The name that had once commanded widespread respect now carried the heavy burden of suspicion. In a society where ancestral memory held immense sway, mere association with a condemned figure could irrevocably shatter a future. For a considerable period, silence became his most prudent and safest strategy. While historical sources are unclear regarding any formal exile, it is evident that Vercingetorix was systematically pushed to the very margins of power. He was no longer welcomed at tribal councils, and his family's once influential voice faded into obscurity. Survival, he quickly learned, demanded extreme restraint. A young noble who dared to speak too boldly risked unequivocally following his father's tragic path. This period, though externally quiet, proved immensely formative. Without a public role or official platform, Vercingetorix honed his skills as a keen observer. He watched intently how leaders engaged in arguments, how alliances subtly shifted, and how fear, more often than honor, truly guided crucial decisions. He astutely learned who truly benefited from his father's downfall and who, in hushed tones, genuinely regretted it. This enforced isolation hardened him. While warrior culture traditionally prized decisive action, he was compelled into a regimen of forced patience. This created an unusual, yet powerful, balance within him. He remained meticulously trained for acts of violence but crucially learned precisely when not to wield it, a critical distinction many other warriors never grasped. He also gained invaluable exposure to wider Gaul. Moving beyond the familiar Arvernian heartland meant encountering diverse other tribes, their unique customs, and their entrenched rivalries. Each of these distinct Gallic groups shared common traditions and a general cultural heritage, but they invariably differed in their leadership styles and their core priorities. Unity was a concept frequently discussed, yet rarely, if ever, truly achieved. Rome itself began to appear with much greater clarity during these years of Vercingetorix's quiet observation. Roman traders, diplomatic envoys, and disciplined soldiers were no longer distant rumors. They were a palpable, organized, and confidently present force. Their strategic alliances with certain Gallic elites inevitably created significant tension. Some chiefs openly admired Roman stability and perceived advantages. Others deeply resented Roman interference but nonetheless accepted Roman gold as a pragmatic necessity. Vercingetorix keenly observed how Rome expertly exploited these existing divisions. It systematically rewarded cooperation with tangible benefits and selectively punished resistance, sowing discord without engaging in full-scale conflict. This calculated strategy effectively weakened Gaul without the need for open warfare, and the lesson was unmistakable in its chilling clarity. In this period of enforced silence, his personal grief also slowly settled, transforming into a steely, quiet resolve. His father's execution was no longer a fresh shock, it had evolved into a pivotal reference point, a constant reminder of the catastrophic cost of fractured leadership and the destructive power of fear-driven politics. By the conclusion of this transformative period, Vercingetorix was no longer merely a dispossessed noble. He had become a careful, shrewd observer of power dynamics, loyalty's shifting sands, and inherent human weaknesses. He had learned that mere bravery was insufficient for survival. It absolutely required impeccable timing. This profound chapter of restraint would make his subsequent, decisive actions appear sudden and explosive to those unprepared. In reality, the seeds of rebellion had been quietly germinating within him, shaped by years of intently watching Gaul systematically undermine itself, while Rome patiently awaited the inevitable disintegration. As Vercingetorix transitioned into early adulthood, Rome ceased to be an abstract, theoretical threat and materialized into a living, breathing system he could meticulously study. He observed Roman influence spreading not through relentless, overt violence, but through a calculated combination of unwavering discipline, sophisticated infrastructure development, and strategically deployed generosity. This complex approach both fascinated and deeply unsettled him in equal measure. Roman soldiers operated fundamentally differently from GIC warriors. They drilled ceaselessly, maintaining peak physical and tactical readiness. They obeyed orders without question or debate, their loyalty institutional and systemic, not reliant on personal charisma. Where GIC leaders depended heavily on their individual reputation and powers of persuasion, Roman commanders relied on an unyielding, hierarchical structure. Vercingetorix recognized the formidable strength inherent in this Roman system, even as he personally despised its unyielding rigidity. He likely encountered Roman auxiliaries and allied GIC leaders who had readily adopted Roman customs, seeing advantage in them. Latin words began subtly entering Gallic speech patterns. Roman goods circulated widely and freely across the lands. Newly constructed roads began to cut relentlessly through ancient tribal territories. Forts, where none had ever existed before, now routinely appeared. These were not invasions in the dramatic, sweeping sense. Rather, they were quiet, deliberate assertions of permanent presence and burgeoning control. Some Gallic nobles readily welcomed this Romanization, as alliance with Rome brought tangible stability, lucrative trade opportunities, and enhanced prestige. Others deeply resented it but crucially lacked the necessary unity to effectively resist. Vercingetorix acutely understood that Rome had no immediate need to conquer Gaul outright. It could patiently wait, allowing Gaul to erode and weaken itself from within. Crucially, Vercingetorix did not serve Rome during this critical period, unlike some other Gallic leaders who actively fought as Roman allies. This intentional detachment preserved his independence, allowing him to learn from detached observation rather than direct, compromised participation. He studied Roman military tactics from the outside, meticulously noticing both their strengths and their potential vulnerabilities. He saw, for instance, how formidable Roman armies struggled when their extended supply lines were cut and when unfamiliar, challenging terrain worked against them. He also observed their profound dependence on strict discipline and rigid order, traits that, paradoxically, could become significant liabilities in chaotic, unpredictable environments. These incisive observations would later profoundly inform his devastating strategy of scorched earth and attrition warfare. Simultaneously, he recognized that relying solely on pure GIC tradition was demonstrably insufficient. Tribal rivalries, unchecked personal ambition, and pervasive fear had already catastrophically destroyed Gallic unity once. His father's tragic fate remained a stark, ever-present warning. Vercingetorix began to envision a bold synthesis: Gallic courage combined with Roman-style coordination, but crucially, without Roman domination. This was a profoundly radical idea within a culture that historically prized fierce individual independence above all forms of centralized organization. This period of intense observation and reflection sharpened his strategic thinking dramatically. He was no longer simply a warrior trained to fight. He was evolving into a leader who deeply understood complex systems. Rome, he concluded, was not invincible, but it could not be confronted blindly or impulsively. By learning from Rome without ever serving it, Vercingetorix meticulously prepared himself for a future confrontation that would demand extraordinary patience, unprecedented unity, and a profound willingness to sacrifice cherished traditions in order to truly preserve Gallic independence. By the time Vercingetorix reached full adulthood, he had attained a profound understanding. Rebellion would not commence with the clash of swords, but rather with the hearts and minds of people. Gaul was not a unified nation. It was a disparate patchwork of fiercely independent tribes, each inherently suspicious of the others. Any overt attempt at imposed unity, he knew, risked tragically repeating his father's fate. Vercingetorix moved with calculated caution, speaking first to those who had suffered losses under the encroaching Roman influence, rather than those who had opportunistically benefited from it. Dispossessed warriors, ambitious younger nobles without established power, and communities burdened by increasing Roman demands proved far more receptive to his message. These were individuals with deeply felt grievances but no collective voice. He framed resistance not as an act of personal ambition, but as an imperative for collective survival. Rome, he emphasized, did not require kings in Gaul, it cultivated collaborators. Tribal elites who aligned themselves with Rome certainly gained short-term security, but at the irreversible cost of their own autonomy. Vercingetorix highlighted this crucial point quietly, allowing others to arrive at this sobering conclusion themselves. His reputation as Cautillo's son worked both for and against him. Some inherently feared his lineage, seeing it as a potential harbinger of his father's tyrannical aspirations. Others, however, viewed it as compelling proof that he viscerally understood the devastating cost of disunity. He made no grandiose promises of easy glory. Instead, he offered a stern commitment to discipline, shared sacrifice, and severe consequences for any betrayal. Unlike traditional GIC leaders who often relied on informal consensus, he insisted on unwavering obedience. Orders were not merely suggestions. Dissent, he made clear, had absolute limits. This uncompromising stance unsettled some of the established nobles, but it resonated deeply with warriors who had grown weary of indecision and fractured command. Vercingetorix understood acutely that Rome would exploit any hesitation mercilessly. Ritual played a vital role in his consolidation of power. Oaths were publicly sworn, binding participants. Communal feasts reinforced vital social bonds. Religion was invoked not merely for legitimacy, but for profound accountability, ensuring that breaking unity became not only political treachery but also a grave spiritual failure. Simultaneously, the Roman presence in Gaul intensified. Caesar's brutal campaigns elsewhere in Gallic territory sent shock waves of terror. Tribes watched in horror as cities fell, defiant leaders were publicly executed, and any resistance was mercilessly crushed. Fear spread far faster than hope. Vercingetorix expertly leveraged this pervasive fear, arguing that delay only guaranteed subjugation. Unity, he declared, offered at least a fighting chance. His message was not one of naive optimism, it was one of urgent, desperate necessity. This delicate stage of his movement was immensely fragile. A single act of betrayal could shatter everything. A solitary accusation of ambition could tragically echo his father's demise. Vercingetorix constantly balanced authority with careful restraint, keenly aware that leadership itself was still widely regarded with suspicion. What he meticulously gathered during this period was not yet an army, but rather an unstoppable momentum, a profound loyalty rooted in shared risk rather than fleeting shared victory. The critical groundwork was laid not with triumphant battles, but with a reluctant consent forged under immense pressure. Rebellion was no longer merely a theoretical idea, it was inexorably becoming a tangible possibility. As this fragile unity slowly coalesced, Vercingetorix faced a defining decision, one that would cement his legacy long before open warfare erupted. Resistance against Rome, he knew, could not resemble past Gallic uprisings. Meeting Roman legions head-on in traditional, pitched battles had failed catastrophically too many times before. Mere courage alone was insufficient. Something far harsher and more radical was imperatively required. Vercingetorix chose a strategy of denial over direct confrontation. If Rome thrived on meticulously maintained supply lines, unwavering order, and pervasive stability, then Gaul, by deliberate design, would become intrinsically unstable. Crops would be systematically destroyed, villages ruthlessly burned, and vital food denied not only to the advancing Roman armies but also, devastatingly, to the Gauls themselves. It was a strategy that demanded an unprecedented level of obedience and sacrifice on a scale Gaul had never even contemplated. This radical decision was, predictably, deeply unpopular. Gallic identity was inextricably linked to the land, its bountiful harvests, and the cherished tradition of hospitality. Burning one's own fields felt like a profound act of betrayal against their very being. Many chiefs hesitated, some openly resisting the horrifying idea. Vercingetorix, however, did not waver. Rome, he reasoned, possessed the resources to rebuild. Gaul, conversely, could not possibly survive under Roman occupation. Enforcing this draconian policy demanded an authority bordering on outright tyranny. Communities that refused to comply faced swift, severe punishment. Livestock was seized without compunction. Leaders were directly threatened. Unity, at last, had teeth, enforced with brutal efficacy. For the very first time, resistance demanded more than mere enthusiasm. It demanded absolute submission to a centralized strategy. This was the long shadow of his father's bitter lesson. Celtilos had reached too far without first securing genuine obedience. Vercingetorix was resolute. He would not repeat that fatal mistake. Unity would be enforced, not merely requested or hoped for. The moral weight of this choice was immense and crushing. Families watched in despair as their homes burned, set alight by Gallic hands. Hunger inevitably followed, and simmering resentment began to brew amongst the populace. Yet the grim alternative was permanent Roman seizure of their lands, crushing taxation, and perpetual control. Vercingetorix shrewdly framed this destruction as temporary suffering, a necessary evil for long-term survival. Rome gravely underestimated this resolve. Roman commanders fully expected the rebellion to fracture under such immense internal pressure. Instead, they encountered only scorched land and deserted roads. Supply lines stretched perilously thin, and military discipline, typically unyielding, began to strain under the immense logistical burden. This pivotal moment marked the true beginning of Vercingetorix's rebellion. Even before a single major battle was fought, he had fundamentally transformed resistance from mere defiance into a calculated, strategic policy. Gaul was no longer simply reacting to Rome. It was actively shaping the very battlefield. The cost was immense, unspeakable, but the choice was deliberate and unyielding. Vercingetorix accepted that genuine leadership meant being as much hated as it was followed. Survival, he realized, required a brutal cruelty turned inward. By choosing fire over submission, he crossed a line few other GIC leaders had ever dared to approach. From this point forward, retreat was impossible. Only ultimate victory or complete annihilation remained. By the time open war loomed on the horizon, the early life of Vercingetorix was already irrevocably over, even if his greatest battles still lay ahead. The boy raised amidst vibrant feasts, heroic stories, and exhilarating warrior games no longer existed. In his place stood a hardened man, forged by betrayal, tempered by immense patience, and possessing a ruthless, unwavering clarity of purpose. Everything that now defined him had been meticulously shaped and honed long before Caesar's legions ever marched deep into Gaul. His noble birth taught him that leadership carried an immense burden of obligation. Oral tradition instilled in him the understanding that memory far outlived any fleeting victory. Warrior training endowed him with incredible endurance. His father's brutal execution taught him with agonizing clarity that unity mattered infinitely more than honor. His period of exile taught him the invaluable discipline of restraint. Rome itself taught him the intricate art of strategy. And ultimately, fire, the deliberate destruction of his own land, taught him the absolute, unyielding nature of authority. Vercingetorix did not merely stumble into rebellion. He arrived at it with deliberate, calculated intent. Unlike earlier GIC leaders who often rose in moments of spontaneous panic or vainglorious pride, Vercingetorix intimately understood the critical importance of timing. He patiently waited until pervasive fear decisively outweighed fleeting comfort, until the Roman presence felt undeniably permanent, until hesitation itself became far more dangerous than active resistance. When he finally acted, his actions felt sudden only to those who had not been closely watching. This is what truly distinguished him. He did not promise easy triumphs. He promised hard-won survival at a terrible, agonizing price. He asked Gaul to suffer profoundly now, in order to merely exist later. Many followed him not out of personal affection, but because they implicitly believed in him and his vision. His authority no longer stemmed from noble blood alone. It emanated from a profound coherence of purpose and a clear, decisive direction. He offered something truly rare and desperately needed in Gaul: definitive direction in a land accustomed to chronic fragmentation, a quality that ultimately rendered him inevitable. Even his Roman enemies sensed this unique quality. Roman sources describe him not as a mere barbarian chief acting on impulsive whims, but rather as a brilliant commander fully capable of continuous learning, swift adaptation, and the unwavering enforcement of severe discipline. That formidable reputation did not materialize overnight. It was painstakingly earned long before any swords were ever crossed in open conflict. The early life of Vercingetorix profoundly explains why he could successfully unite disparate tribes that had distrusted one another for generations. It explains why he could command the widespread destruction of their own land and be obeyed without question. It explains why he could wield immense power without a crown in a culture that deeply despised kingship. By the time history finally takes widespread notice of him, the foundational work is already meticulously complete. The rebellion that subsequently unfolds is not the narrative of a sudden, spontaneous uprising. It is the culmination of a childhood lived under immense pressure and a society tearing itself apart, all while a greater, more organized power inexorably closed in. Vercingetorix did not rise from nowhere. He rose from deep-seated memory, profound loss, and years of meticulous preparation. And by then, Gaul, facing annihilation, had no other viable choice. Long before the magnificent city of Alexandria rose to dominate Egypt's sweeping coastline, the ancient city of Thonis Heraclean stood as a vigilant sentinel at the very mouth of the Nile River, effectively controlling the most vital gateway into the entire kingdom. Every single ship arriving from the vast Mediterranean Sea was compelled to pass through its bustling harbors first. This unique geographic advantage alone made the city utterly indispensable. It was not merely a convenient port, it functioned as Egypt's comprehensive customs gate, a sacred religious threshold, and an intricate economic filter, all rolled into one pivotal hub. The fertile Nile Delta was the undeniable lifeline of Egypt, and Thonis Heraclean was strategically positioned precisely where the river's life-giving waters met the expansive sea. Goods flowed ceaselessly through its elaborate docks in a constant, vibrant motion. Precious grain from the incredibly fertile interior, valuable papyrus, fine linen, gleaming gold, and sacred offerings moved outward to distant lands. Inward, the city received coveted wine, rich olive oil, intricate metalwork, and exotic foreign luxuries. Rigorous officials meticulously monitored cargo, assiduously collected taxes, and strictly enforced regulations long before foreign merchants were permitted to trade deeper inland. The entire city was ingeniously constructed for a life on water. Winding canals replaced traditional streets, and sleek boats served as the primary mode of transport instead of cumbersome carts. Grand warehouses, majestic temples, and imposing administrative buildings rose elegantly along the shifting channels that intricately connected the city's myriad islands. To any arriving sailor, Thonis Heraclean must have presented an impression of vibrant life, almost seeming to float with incessant traffic moving in every conceivable direction, its bustling commercial activity seamlessly interwoven with profound ritual practices. Power here was not solely economic. Thonis Heraclean also functioned as a sacred space of immense importance. Before foreign traders were granted permission to conduct any business within the sacred confines of Egypt, they were strictly required to perform. To appease the city's deities, regular offerings were made. Temples strategically rose near the docks, ensuring that every act of trade commenced with a gesture of ritual reverence and submission. This pervasive integration of religious practice and administrative governance deeply reinforced the Egyptian worldview, which held that true prosperity emanated from divine favor, rather than merely from commercial profit. The city's diverse populace mirrored its pivotal role as a vibrant gateway. Egyptian priests coexisted with Greek merchants, while sailors, translators, tax collectors, and countless laborers thronged the bustling harbors. A vibrant tapestry of languages overlapped, and customs intermingled freely. Yet, beneath this dynamic exchange, a strict order prevailed. Thonis Heraclean was far from a free port. It was meticulously controlled, vigilantly observed, and rigorously regulated at every single level of its operation. For several centuries, Thonis Heraclean flourished, its prosperity directly attributable to its strategic geographical placement. As long as the life-giving Nile sustained Egypt and the bountiful sea channels facilitated trade, the city maintained its critical importance. Its steadily accumulated wealth exuded an air of confident permanence, and became an indispensable, deeply integrated component of Egypt's national infrastructure. No architect or builder, constructing temples or warehouses in this seemingly impregnable location, could have possibly conceived that the very ground beneath their magnificent creations would ever yield. From its sun-drenched surface, Thonis Heraclean projected an image of eternal stability, firmly anchored between the river and the sea, utterly oblivious that the very waters sustaining its existence were quietly, inexorably, orchestrating its ultimate demise. Thonis Heraclean was far more than simply a city with two distinct names. It was a vibrant urban center that simultaneously embodied two profound cultural realities. To the native Egyptians, it was Thonis, a hallowed port deeply bound by sacred ritual law, divine authority, and the ancient, unchanging rhythms of the Nile. To the arriving Greeks, it was Heraclean, a recognizable and welcoming gateway, named in honor of Heracles, the legendary hero they believed had once graced its shores with his presence. Both appellations were commonly used, often by the very same individuals, the choice subtly shifting depending on the cultural background of the listener. This dual identity eloquently reflected the city's unparalleled position as a crucial crossroads where civilizations met and mingled. Greek merchants, sailing in from the Aegean Sea, did not feel entirely alienated upon their arrival here. They found a degree of familiarity in recognizing the name Heraclean, encountered gods whose attributes resonated with their own pantheon, and discovered established communities already adept at and comfortable with cross-cultural exchange. Egyptian priests, on the other hand, diligently upheld strict religious control, meticulously ensuring that no foreign presence ever dared to challenge the sacred order of their traditions. This unique blending of cultures was rooted in practicality, not sentimentality. Egyptians readily tolerated Greek traders because they consistently delivered the wealth and desirable goods that Egypt sought. Conversely, Greeks respectfully observed Egyptian rituals because their vital access to the lucrative trade routes depended entirely on such adherence. In this unique environment, religion transcended its spiritual role and became a vital common language. Greek deities were seamlessly identified with their Egyptian counterparts. For instance, Heracles was intrinsically linked to local powerful deities associated with strength and vital protection. This intricate religious syncretism not only facilitated smoother commercial transactions but also significantly reduced instances of conflict. Historical documents and various inscriptions strongly indicate that Thonis Heracleion served as Egypt's primary official international port for a considerable period, long before the city of Alexandria even came into existence. All foreign vessels were strictly mandated to dock here, register their cargo, and dutifully pay the required duties. Only after these rigorous checks were completed could they continue their journey inland. This strategic control bestowed enormous leverage upon the city, making it a critical choke point. It held the ultimate power to determine who entered Egypt, and under precisely what conditions. Daily life in the city vividly reflected this delicate balance of control and exchange. Greek sailors could be found socializing in Egyptian taverns, while Egyptian officials diligently learned key Greek trade terminology. Mixed households, blending both cultures, were not an uncommon sight. Yet, clear boundaries persistently remained. Sacred spaces were kept exclusively Egyptian, political authority steadfastly stayed local, and all cultural exchange, though vibrant, occurred consistently under careful supervision. The city's two names were not conflicting identities vying for dominance. Rather, they functioned as incredibly effective tools. Each name allowed different cultural groups to interpret and understand the very same place through the lens of their own familiar concepts and traditions. Thonis Heracleion's enduring success stemmed from its remarkable ability to simultaneously embody multiple roles without ever relinquishing control. This intrinsic flexibility not only fostered its prosperity and resilience but also, paradoxically, rendered it deeply reliant on unwavering stability. The city thrived robustly as long as the currents of trade flowed freely and its intricate rituals retained their profound meaning. However, when those crucial conditions inevitably shifted, its meticulously balanced world would find itself devoid of any solid foundation, left with nothing but water, fading memory, and a name destined to sink into oblivion alongside it. Religion in Thonis Heracleion was not relegated to quiet, secluded sanctuaries. It utterly dominated the city's very layout, dictated its daily rhythm, and underpinned all administrative authority. Temples were not built remotely from commercial activity. Instead, they rose majestically directly beside the bustling harbors and vital canals, ensuring that a sacred presence vigilantly watched over every arrival, every transaction, and every departure. The most significant sanctuary was reverently dedicated to Amun-Jerb, a localized manifestation of the powerful god Amun. This temple was a truly immense edifice, constructed of stone intended to endure for eternity, its approaches firmly anchored and guarded by colossal statues and imposing sphinxes. To step into the city was, in essence, to step into divine territory. No ship could enter without first passing these profound symbols of sacred authority. Furthermore, a network of sacred canals intricately connected the temples to one another, transforming ritual processions into magnificent floating ceremonies. During grand festivals, priests would solemnly move statues of the gods through these waterways on elaborately decorated barges, dramatically reenacting ancient myths and symbolically renewing divine favor for the city. These were not private, esoteric events, they were powerful public performances of authority, unmistakably reminding both inhabitants and foreign visitors alike who truly commanded the city. Temple storehouses were perpetually filled with abundant offerings, gold, grain, aromatic incense, and imported luxuries flowed steadily into the sacred hands of the priesthood. In essence, these temples functioned as crucial banks, effectively redistributing wealth, funding extensive construction projects, and consistently supporting the elaborate priestly hierarchies. Indeed, religious authority and economic control were utterly inseparable in Thony's Heraclean, forming a single, symbiotic system. The city's very architecture was designed to reinforce an illusion of permanence. Massive stone blocks were carefully set upon what appeared to be utterly solid ground. Sturdy columns rose from platforms painstakingly constructed to withstand the ravages of flooding. To the ancient builders, the city felt supremely secure, protected equally by the watchful gods and by their own ingenious engineering. Foreigners, too, were compelled to participate, at least in a symbolic capacity. Before commencing any trade, merchants were required to offer gifts or pay specific ritual fees. This was no mere superstition, it was a profound political theology. Egypt's immense wealth, it was believed, existed solely because the gods permitted it. To ignore them, therefore, was to invite cosmic chaos and disaster. The temples also served as vital administrative hubs, meticulously storing records, precisely measuring water levels, and regulating the all-important calendars. They were, in effect, sophisticated administrative centers artfully disguised as sacred spaces. Knowledge flowed through the priests with as much efficacy as power did. Ironically, this very emphasis on monumental permanence ultimately rendered the city vulnerable. The immense weight of its heavy stone structures pressed relentlessly into the unstable sediment below, inadvertently accelerating the process of subsidence. The very monuments intended to anchor Thony's Heraclean and ensure its longevity ironically contributed to its slow, centuries-long descent. Nevertheless, during the zenith of its power, the city's temples stood as undeniable, visible proof that divine order and human ambition could not only coexist but thrive in spectacular harmony. The majestic river and the expansive sea met under the vigilant gaze of sacred watchtowers, and for many generations, Thony's Heraclean appeared utterly immovable. The gods seemed firmly established, their presence unwavering. The mighty water itself seemed obedient to human will. No one harbored even the slightest suspicion that the foundations beneath those towering, sacred sanctuaries were slowly, grain by grain, dissolving, quietly preparing to erase an entire sacred city from the very surface of the world. Thony's Heraclean's power was not an accidental consequence of fortune. Its immense wealth was derived from meticulous control, not merely from excess. Every single ship that ventured into Egypt via the intricate Nile Delta was strictly required to halt here, and each mandatory stop generated substantial revenue. Taxes, storage fees, ritual offerings, and thorough inspections effectively transformed every movement of goods into a source of considerable income. The harbor was a perpetually vibrant spectacle. Merchant vessels from Greece, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and the wider Mediterranean region anchored gracefully alongside robust Egyptian barges laden with grain and stone. Cranes swung busily, and countless laborers toiled along the wooden and stone quaysides. Warehouses were strategically positioned close to the water's edge, allowing goods to be transferred with maximum speed and efficiency before the shifting tides or currents could interfere. Trade was subjected to exceptionally tight regulation. Officials meticulously recorded every cargo, precisely weighed goods, and rigorously enforced all restrictions. Certain valuable items could not be transported further inland without explicit permission, and smuggling was met with severe punishment. Thony's Heraclean thus functioned as both a bustling marketplace and an unyielding checkpoint. Ritual permeated every single transaction. Before unloading their cargo, captains were obligated to make solemn offerings to the local deities. Sacred fees were dutifully paid alongside the regular taxes. These ritualistic acts profoundly reinforced Egypt's authority and served as a constant reminder to all foreigners that commerce here was never purely an economic affair. Annual festivals further amplified the city's profound importance. Sacred processions attracted vast crowds from across the entire Delta region. Divine statues were ceremoniously carried on barges through the canals, accompanied by enchanting music, fragrant incense, and rhythmic chanting. These spectacular events skillfully blended deep religious devotion with grand public spectacle, effectively reinforcing loyalty among the populace and drawing a steady stream of eager visitors. Wealth became visibly concentrated and prominently displayed. Colossal statues, richly decorated shrines, and finely carved reliefs proudly showcased the city's immense prosperity. Coins and coveted imported luxuries circulated widely throughout the city. Even ordinary laborers experienced a tangible share of the city's abundance through grand festivals and generous temple distributions. Yet, this very prosperity, ironically, fostered a perilous dependence. Thony's Heraclean's identity was almost entirely interwoven with its singular function as a gateway. It failed to diversify its economic or strategic role. As long as trade flowed unimpeded through its channels, the city thrived. However, should those trade routes ever shift, its very relevance would inevitably vanish. This inherent vulnerability remained entirely invisible at first. For many centuries, nothing substantially challenged the city's dominant position. The Nile continued its timeless flow, ships consistently arrived at its harbors, and temples continued to receive their due offerings. But beneath this tranquil surface, immense geological pressure was relentlessly building. Sediment slowly shifted, foundations groaned under increasing strain. And far to the west, the future city of Alexandria had not yet been founded, but the precise conditions for its eventual rise were already quietly, inexorably, forming. At its zenith, Thony's Heraclean stood at the absolute peak of its influence, wealthy, profoundly sacred, and utterly indispensable. It remained tragically unaware that its greatest strength, its masterful control of trade, would one day be irrevocably transferred elsewhere, ultimately leaving its magnificent temples, bustling harbors, and deeply ingrained rituals without purpose, standing precariously on ground that could no longer sustain their immense weight. Thony's Heraclean did not succumb to a violent invasion or a sudden, catastrophic event. Instead, it failed subtly and quietly from below. The city had been meticulously constructed upon layers of soft Nile silt, sediment thoughtfully deposited over centuries by the ever-shifting river channels. This ground appeared deceptively solid, yet it behaved more like a saturated sponge than unyielding stone. As long as environmental conditions remained stable, the city endured. However, when those conditions began to change, the very land itself started its slow, relentless betrayal. Earthquakes, originating in the eastern Mediterranean, periodically sent tremors through the Delta region. Even mild seismic activity had profound and serious consequences here, as the waterlogged soil swiftly lost its structural strength, a process now scientifically understood as liquefaction. Magnificent buildings that had proudly stood for generations suddenly tilted precariously, cracked profoundly, or even sank into the soft earth. Foundations slid menacingly sideways. Massive stone blocks shifted violently out of alignment. Canals widened dramatically as the ground beneath them collapsed inward. Compounding this pervasive problem was the relentless rise in sea levels. As the Mediterranean slowly but surely encroached further inland, salt water gradually seeped into the delta's fragile sediments, weakening them even more significantly. Consequently, flooding became far more frequent and severe. Neighborhoods situated closest to the vulnerable coast bore the initial brunt of this environmental onslaught. Streets were transformed into permanent waterways, and houses were first abandoned, then inevitably swallowed by the encroaching waters. The immense weight of the city's monumental architecture tragically exacerbated the entire situation. Temples and colossal statues pressed downward relentlessly, accelerating their own destruction. Structures meticulously designed to last forever inadvertently hastened their demise, for when the ground softened, the heavy stone had nowhere else to go but down. The entire process was gradual, yet utterly relentless. One generation adapted and rebuilt, only for the next to do the same. Canals were routinely rerouted, and platforms were painstakingly raised. Repairs were constant, exorbitantly expensive, and increasingly ineffectual. Each temporary fix merely bought a little more time, never true stability. People, of course, noticed these alarming changes. Priests interpreted the escalating disasters as dire divine warnings. Officials struggled desperately to maintain the city's crumbling infrastructure. Trade inevitably slowed as the once reliable harbors became increasingly unpredictable. Ships began to avoid the shallower, constantly shifting channels. Confidence in the city eroded just as steadily as the land itself. There was no singular, dramatic moment when Thony's Heraclean was definitively declared doomed. Instead, the city faded slowly, imperceptibly, in distinct stages. Entire areas were quietly abandoned. Sacred rituals were gradually relocated elsewhere. Administration centers shifted further inland. What remained of the city stood increasingly isolated, enveloped by water and an eerie silence. Nature did not erase the city with violent force. Rather, it gently absorbed it. Stones silently slipped beneath the mud. Statues majestically toppled and vanished into the depths. Temples, remarkably, sank largely intact, miraculously preserving their form even as they disappeared from sight. By the time the final structures succumbed to the waters, Thony's Heraclean was already a mere shadow of its former self. The once mighty city that had controlled Egypt's gateway to the world had become an inconvenience, then merely a fading memory. The ground had spoken its truth slowly, patiently, and without any drama, and in the end, it unequivocally won. As Thony's Heraclean gradually weakened, the entire world around it began to transform. The city's decline was not an isolated event. Rather, it coincided with significant shifts in political power, established trade routes, and strategic national priorities, ultimately leaving the once essential port increasingly marginalized and sidelined. The most decisive blow to Thony's Heraclean did not originate from the forces of nature, but rather from its replacement. In the late 4th century B.C.E., Alexander the Great founded the city of Alexandria to the west. Unlike Thony's Heraclean, Alexandria was strategically built on much firmer ground and meticulously designed with long-term expansion and growth in mind. Its harbors were naturally deep, exceptionally well protected, and far better suited to accommodate large naval fleets. From its very inception, Alexandria was intended to be a grand capital city, not merely a customs checkpoint. Trade, naturally, gravitated toward stability. Merchants overwhelmingly preferred reliable docks and a predictable, efficient administration. Royal patronage generously flowed into Alexandria, attracting a vibrant influx of skilled artisans, brilliant scholars, and influential officials. Consequently, customs duties were swiftly redirected to the new capital. Religious prestige, in turn, followed political power, and the temples that had once held immense significance in Thony's Heraclean gradually lost their influence. The venerable old port struggled desperately to compete. Its harbors began to silt up, and necessary repairs grew exponentially more expensive. Each subsequent earthquake or flood relentlessly pushed the city further toward complete irrelevance. Administrators quietly relocated to Alexandria. Priests, facing dwindling congregations, followed suit. Rituals that had once anchored the city's identity were slowly moved inland or westward. This was not a dramatic, sudden abandonment. Rather, families left gradually, warehouses slowly emptied, and the once bustling temples fell into an eerie silence. Boats bypassed the familiar, increasingly treacherous channels. What had once been the magnificent gateway to Egypt slowly deteriorated into a forgotten backwater, and eventually, a dangerous hazard. Ultimately, nature completed the work that political shifts had begun. Relentless flooding erased the remaining neighborhoods. Canals merged seamlessly with the encroaching sea. Buildings quietly collapsed beneath the waterline. The city slipped beneath the delta with no ceremony, no final farewell. By the early medieval period, Thony's Heraclean had vanished entirely. Its name persisted in scattered ancient texts, but its physical location was utterly lost to memory. Maps of the era showed only water where a thriving city once stood. Alexandria, by then, reigned supreme, its magnificent libraries and bustling harbors completely eclipsing the memory of all earlier ports. The meteoric rise of Alexandria definitively sealed Thonis Heraclean's fate. It did not merely replace the old city, it fundamentally erased the very need for its existence. What remained was a sunken, silent shell, perfectly preserved by layers of mud and the profound stillness of the deep, patiently waiting for a future generation that held no memory of the once mighty port that had controlled Egypt's vital entrance to the world. Once Thonis Heraclean had completely disappeared beneath the waters of the Nile Delta, it left no discernible ruins behind for inquisitive travelers to explore. It left absolutely nothing visible at all. There were no broken columns on land, no half-buried walls, only vast expanses of water, thick mud, and ever-shifting currents. Over the passage of time, this profound absence transformed the city from a historical fact into an elusive legend. Ancient writers occasionally mentioned Thonis and Heraclean in passing references. Herodotus, for instance, described a magnificent port at Egypt's entrance. Other historical sources alluded to temples, specific rituals, and numerous foreign merchants, but crucially, without any accompanying physical remains. Later scholars became embroiled in debates over whether these accounts referred to a single city, multiple settlements, or perhaps something entirely symbolic rather than genuinely real. Some scholars postulated that the descriptions of Thonis Heraclean were exaggerated. Others conjectured that it had been confused with nearby cities like Canopus or Alexandria. Without tangible evidence, the scholarly debate inevitably stalled. Maps were redrawn, omitting the phantom city. The city slowly faded from serious academic discourse. By the modern era, it existed primarily as a mere footnote, a historical curiosity briefly mentioned and then summarily dismissed. Local fishermen, occasionally, spoke of strange stone shapes beneath the water, of their nets snagging on something solid, or their anchors unexpectedly catching, yet the delta is famously replete with debris, and such anecdotal stories rarely traveled far or gained widespread credence. The omnipresent mud swiftly concealed everything. The Nile, it seemed, was remarkably efficient at erasing its own past. For more than a millennium, the city lay remarkably intact beneath dense layers of silt. Statues rested precisely where they had fallen. Temples, astonishingly, remained standing, their massive columns slowly sinking deeper but resisting collapse. Ships gently settled onto the harbor floor, their precious cargo still preserved aboard. Time itself seemed to slow underwater. Ironically, this very submersion paradoxically preserved the city in a way that abandonment above ground never could have. Unlike cities that were looted or systematically dismantled, Thonis Heraclean was completely sealed away. No later builders reused its valuable stone. No conquerors stripped its opulent temples bare. The city was not truly destroyed, it was, rather, meticulously archived by the sea. To professional historians, this profound absence created significant doubt. Civilizations of such importance were expected to leave undeniable scars on the landscape, enduring physical traces. A city of such magnitude, it was reasoned, should have certainly left something behind. The pervasive silence felt deeply suspicious. And yet, that silence was utterly real. Thonis Heraclean had not vanished because it never existed. It had vanished because it had sunk completely, swallowed by the very waters that had once been the source of its immense power. The sea patiently guarded its secret, while human history continued its relentless march, largely convinced that the lost city belonged more to the realm of myth than to tangible reality. However, that enduring illusion would not last forever. In the late 20th century, the long-held myth finally began to crack. Groundbreaking advances in underwater surveying technology made it scientifically possible to systematically search the muddy seabed of the Nile Delta, rather than relying on blind chance. In 1996, a dedicated team led by the renowned French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio commenced scanning areas long suspected of concealing something ancient, although very few truly believed that an entire city could ever be definitively found. What dramatically emerged from the depths was not merely a scattered ruin in fragments, but rather a remarkably preserved city, frozen in a state of sudden collapse. Beneath several meters of water and thick, encompassing layers of silt lay massive stone blocks, majestically toppled columns, and statues of such immense size that no ordinary fishing debris could possibly account for them. Sonar maps vividly revealed clear street layouts, intricate canals, and well-defined harbor basins. This was unequivocally not a coincidence. It was unmistakably evidence of deliberate urban planning. When divers finally descended into the ancient depths, the sheer scale of the discovery became utterly undeniable. Colossal statues of kings and gods lay peacefully on their sides, their faces still remarkably intact. Enigmatic sphinxes rested in the soft mud, half-buried yet unmistakable in their form. Temple walls stood precisely where they had fallen, perfectly preserved by the protective sediment that shielded them from erosion. Shipwrecks densely filled the ancient harbor. More than 70 vessels were eventually identified, some still laden with their original cargo, others likely ceremonial barges. Anchors, ropes, and wooden hulls eloquently told the story of a port abruptly frozen mid-function. Trade here had not slowly decayed, it had been suddenly and dramatically interrupted. Inscriptions discovered among the ruins definitively confirmed the city's identity. Names of gods, rulers, and places perfectly matched ancient historical records. These ancient texts were finally vindicated as Thonis and Heracleon emerged together from the depths, conclusively resolving a historical debate that had persisted for centuries. The legendary port city, once considered mythological by many, was undeniably real, situated precisely where ancient sources had cryptically indicated. This profound discovery left archaeologists in a state of utter astonishment. In stark contrast to land-based archaeological sites, which are often ravaged by centuries of looting and human interference, Thonis Heracleon emerged remarkably intact from its watery grave. Massive statues had toppled gracefully rather than shattering into fragments. Grand temples had submerged rather than being systematically dismantled. Even the most delicate artifacts, usually perishable, survived pristine within the oxygen-poor, protective mud. With each successive excavation season, the city yielded an astonishing array of treasures, elaborate gold ritual objects, countless coins spanning 1,000 years of commerce, and humble everyday tools, eerily preserved right where their owners had dropped them. The final demise of this magnificent city was not a violent catastrophe marked by fire or destruction. Instead, its end was strikingly quiet and gradual. It unfolded suddenly enough to halt all activity in an instant, yet gently enough to meticulously preserve every detail of its active life beneath the encroaching waters. For historians, this extraordinary discovery completely rewrote the conventional understanding of ancient Egypt's coastal history. Thonis Heracleon ceased to be a mere whispered rumor. It materialized as a vibrant, missing chapter, almost perfectly recovered. After more than a millennium submerged beneath the Mediterranean, the city had finally resurfaced, not to reclaim its former life, but to speak once more, articulating its story stone by painstakingly preserved stone from the very seabed where it had patiently awaited its rediscovery, for human memory to finally catch up. Thonis Heracleon's significance extends far beyond the simple fact that it was lost and then found. Its profound value truly lies in the invaluable insights it offers into the intricate mechanisms by which civilizations flourish, adapt to changing circumstances, and then, often so subtly, vanish. This was no peripheral settlement destroyed by conflict. It stood as a central, immensely wealthy, deeply sacred, and utterly essential metropolis. And yet, remarkably, it simply disappeared, almost without a trace of struggle. The city stands as a powerful testament to how profoundly dependent political and economic power can be on geographic circumstances. Thonis Heracleon prospered immensely due to its strategic access to water, vital trade routes, and established ritual authority. Yet, ironically, the very environment that nurtured its existence ultimately sealed its fate. As the land gradually softened and sea levels inexorably rose, neither its immense wealth nor its deep-seated traditions could offer any protection. The gods were honored with fervent devotion, taxes meticulously paid, and elaborate rituals performed without fail. But nature, indifferent to human endeavors, simply did not negotiate. Furthermore, this discovery lays bare the profound fragility of human memory. For untold centuries, scholars dismissed and doubted the city's very existence, precisely because no tangible remnants survived on land. Historical understanding, it seems, has often been biased toward what is visibly present. Thonis Heraclean powerfully reminds us that a lack of visible evidence or historical silence does not equate to insignificance. Indeed, entire worlds, rich in culture and history, possess the capacity to vanish from human sight without leaving behind any obvious or visible scars on the landscape. This remarkable city fundamentally reshapes our entire understanding of ancient Egypt's intricate and often underestimated relationship with the broader Mediterranean world. It definitively proves that cultural exchange between these great powers was far from occasional. It was a deeply systematic and integral aspect of daily life. Greeks and Egyptians engaged in constant interaction, albeit under strict regulatory frameworks, fostering a dynamic and pervasive cross-cultural dialogue. The lesson here is clear: globalization is not a modern phenomenon, but an ancient and recurring pattern of human interaction. Beyond its historical revelations, Thonis Heraclean also holds a potent warning for contemporary societies. Its demise was not a sudden, cataclysmic collapse that might have spurred immediate and drastic reforms. Instead, its decline was distressingly gradual, seemingly manageable, and therefore dangerously easy to postpone. Minor repairs were undertaken, subtle adjustments were made, and no single, overwhelming disaster ever forced a mass evacuation. Yet, by the time abandonment became an undeniable and inevitable reality, it was tragically already too late to reverse its fate. However, this very act of underwater preservation bestows upon us a truly rare and invaluable gift, a city left utterly unaltered by the hands of later generations. What we are privileged to witness here is not a history painstakingly rebuilt or reinterpreted, but life itself, abruptly interrupted. We see tools left precisely where they were last used, ships still moored at their sunken docks, and grand statues toppled exactly where they once proudly stood. It is, in essence, archaeology without any subsequent overprinting or revision. Even today, Thonis Heraclean continues to rest peacefully beneath the shallow waters, much of its vast expanse still largely unexplored. The vast majority of this ancient metropolis remains untouched, meticulously sealed by layers of protective silt. What has been painstakingly uncovered thus far represents only a tiny fraction of the profound secrets that still lie hidden within its depths. This sunken city, in its very existence, teaches us a profound sense of humility. It reminds us that civilizations do not invariably meet their end in dramatic conflagrations or through violent conquest. Sometimes, they simply sink away quietly, vanishing from human perception, to be remembered and rediscovered only when our technological capabilities and insatiable curiosity finally converge to retrieve them. Thonis Heraclean once presided over Egypt's vital gateway for many centuries. Now, it lies serenely beneath that very gateway, preserved not by the enduring strength of stone or the fleeting grip of human memory, but by the eternal embrace of water itself, patiently waiting beneath the Nile Delta, a silent yet eloquent testament to how effortlessly permanence itself can dissolve.